They were supposed to be extinct, annihilated, burned from the annals of history, like a plague on parchment. In 1312, the Knights Templar were shattered by papal decree, their leaders tortured, their riches seized, their legacy buried beneath a tide of royal betrayal and whispered heresy. But something doesn't add up. Instead of fading, their symbols reappeared in the most unlikely of places. Royal crests, Masonic rites, military medals, even banking empires. They died in fire, and yet their shadow kept growing. How does an order meant for extinction become invisible instead? Of course, history doesn't always close its doors. Sometimes it leaves them ajar just wide enough for a secret to slip through. So breathe easy, settle in. The noise of the modern world is far behind you now. We're headed somewhere quieter and much older. The last embers of the Templar bonfires still smolder in our imagination. Cloaked knights in crimson crosses, secret rituals beneath moonlit chapels, lost relics hidden beneath ancient stone. But the truth, the one wrapped in dust, denial, and decades of strategic silence, is far more disturbing than the legend. Because this isn't a story about an order that vanished. It's a story about one that learned how to hide. As castles fell and kings changed thrones, a thread remained unbroken, unseen, but never truly severed. It threaded its way through Scottish battlefields, Portuguese docks, Florentine banks, and quiet cathedrals where no one dared speak of what was written in the margins. This is the story of a hidden order, one that may have never stopped pulling the levers of power. Not in the open, but in the hush behind royal curtains, in the margins of treaties, and in the coded gestures passed between elite circles. They weren't just knights. They were networkers, strategists, financiers. And if the signs are correct, they're still here. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The smoke from the pyres still hung in the Parisian air when the rumors began. They spread not from noble lips, but from sailors in low taverns, from merchants along the Atlantic ports, from trembling priests who had seen too much and said too little. It was whispered that as Jacques de Molay was marched to the stake, a fleet of Templar ships quietly vanished from the harbor at La Rochelle, gone without a trace, without a flag, without a destination. Not sunk, not captured, gone. That was the word that echoed through the frightened streets, vanished. For an order supposedly dismantled and destroyed, their fleet's disappearance suggested preparation, coordination, and survival. The harbor at La Rochelle was no ordinary outpost. It was one of the most strategically placed naval stations in medieval Europe. The Templars had built it not just for trade or travel, but for exactly what the Church had feared most: autonomy. Their own ships, their own routes, their own ports, often outside the grasp of both king and pope. It had been their quiet strength for years, overlooked, while the kings focused on their treasure and the papacy obsessed over heresy trials. And now, with one swift tide, it became their salvation. Modern historians still debate the size of the fleeing fleet. Some claim there were only a handful of ships carrying a few desperate brothers, and perhaps a chest or two of gold. Others insist the number was closer to 18, fully stocked, with men documents and artifacts of significant importance. A few fringe accounts, mostly dismissed, speak of scrolls sealed in wax bearing the sigils of both Solomon and a serpent. What's agreed upon, though, is this: the fleet left, and it left fast. The timing was too precise to be anything but planned. Someone had warned them, someone with access to inner circles. Here's the odd thing: no records exist of royal ships sent in pursuit. Philip IV, a man who micromanaged vengeance with surgical precision, never lifted a finger to chase them. It's as if he wanted the survivors gone or feared what might happen if they were caught. After all, when you torch a heretic, you win. But when you capture an organized escape, you might reveal an intelligence network still functioning beneath the ash. Some say the ships headed west toward Scotland, a land then excommunicated and already sympathetic to Templar exiles. Others whisper they sailed to Portugal, where a young King Denis had always been lukewarm about their prosecution. There's even a few bold tales of the fleet disappearing beyond the Pillars of Hercules, toward islands unnamed and maps unmarked. These legends, though colorful, usually come with a generous helping of sea monsters and buried crosses. Entertaining, but not useful. Still, they show how deep the mythos runs. What cannot be ignored is the silence of the Church. While papal bulls condemned and disbanded the Templars across Europe, no official statement was ever issued regarding the missing ships. That's not normal. Rome loved closure. Heresy needed to be sealed with a stamp. Yet here there's only absence, a blank spot in the archives, as unsettling as a scream cut short. Even in recent decades, fragments have emerged. A lead-encased logbook found in an abandoned Portuguese chapel listed dates and nautical symbols unknown to the region. A fragment of a sail bearing the Red Cross was pulled from beneath a dock in Aberdeen, though carbon dating remains inconclusive. And then there's the letter unsigned, untranslated for decades, tucked into the archives of the Vatican's Secretum. It mentions the 12 hands that guided the fleet beneath the moon of betrayal. 12 hands? 6 pairs. 6 captains or 6 factions, no one agrees. But the phrasing suggests hierarchy, coordination, and a surviving structure. And then, there's the most persistent rumor of all, the one dismissed by scholars, but privately passed among archivists like contraband, that the fleet did not flee. It split. That it was not an exodus, but a dispersion. Some vessels went north, others south, and a few simply remained at sea. Circling, waiting, becoming mobile command centers for a network that no longer needed castles or temples, only currents. This theory, while speculative, offers a chilling possibility. If true, then the fleet wasn't a relic of the past. It was the first evolution of a new order. One not bound by stone walls or rigid hierarchy, but by code secrecy and movement. A floating network, adaptable, invisible, and alive. There's an obscure Jesuit letter from the late 1500s, unearthed only recently, that refers to the sea phantoms and claims they were the last true knights, those who refused both pope and prophet, yet bowed to a shadowed cross. Whether metaphor or memory, it's one of the few post-dissolution references that links ocean loyalty and the Templar symbol. And what if, just what if, that symbol endured, not just on shields, but in the unseen agreements between merchant houses, in the safe passage given to certain ships, in the silent protection offered to key figures. This is where the real mystery begins. Not with what they carried, but with who they carried. There are quiet suggestions, names smudged in records, heirs sent away for protection, alliances forged on docks under cover of night. Which brings us to the question no historian can comfortably answer. What if the Templars didn't run? What if they simply moved and waited for the world to forget? The air in La Rochelle still smells of salt and secrets. The docks remain older now, worn by time, but still facing west. And on certain nights when the mist rolls in just right, some say you can still hear wood creak beneath invisible feet, as if something waits, as if not everything that vanishes is lost. If the night of the vanished fleet was an act of escape, then what followed was something far more deliberate: reinvention. Survival wasn't enough. The men who had once worn the Red Cross weren't content to fade into myth. They sought continuity not through brute force or open banners, but through something quieter, more resilient. They became whispers in the docks, sigils etched beneath floorboards, oaths sworn not in Latin Mass, but in candlelit corners of places the Church had long ceased to watch. This was not the end of the Templars. It was the beginning of something colder, cleverer, an order built not on stone, but on strategy. It began as most careful revolutions do in the margins. The exiled brothers scattered by sea, and smoke did not all flee to the same place. Some arrived in the north of Scotland, drawn to its isolation and its shared enemy in the papacy. Others found themselves welcomed quietly by the Portuguese king, whose fondness for the Templars had never quite dissolved under the pressure of papal threats. And a few, the most daring, or perhaps the most compromised, drifted eastward toward Venice and the city-states that understood the power of maritime secrecy better than any crown. In these places, something unusual began to happen. Men with no official rank, stripped of titles, accused of heresy, began to gather again. Not as Templars, at least, not publicly, but as traders, mercenaries, scribes, and navigators. In Scotland, they mingled with landless knights and clan leaders distrustful of papal authority. In Portugal, they were given new names: Order of Christ, Military Order of Aviz organizations that bore striking similarities to their old chain of command, but with conveniently altered mission statements. And in Venice, well, Venice needed no excuses. The Republic had always thrived on plausible deniability and profitable secrets. These weren't coincidences. Records suggest that within a generation of the Templar purge, over a dozen port cities across Europe showed signs of coordinated activity, sealed letters with identical wax patterns, foreign coins appearing in sudden abundance, and land purchases made by individuals with no known family or prior holdings. In a Florentine ledger from 1328, a note references clienti dell'ombra, clients of the shadow. They paid in advance, always in coin, never asked for receipts. But perhaps the most compelling detail lies not in what they built, but in what they remembered. These survivors kept their symbols alive not openly but through echoes. A Maltese cross etched into a chapel beam, barely visible unless struck by moonlight. The use of certain numbers in shipping manifests 8, 13, 33. A strange preference for ciphers based on Hebrew alphabets and Arabic numerals. Rituals were whispered through generations, not as spiritual acts, but as behavioral code. How to recognize a brother, how to test for loyalty, how to remain unseen. There's a curious story from the outskirts of Porto, where an abandoned abbey formerly turned over to the crown was found to still be receiving weekly food deliveries for over 50 years. The man who managed the route died without revealing who paid him. When the building was finally searched, the basement had been transformed into what archaeologists describe as a communications hub, multiple exits, coded markings, and a concealed well that led to an underground river. In one of the side chambers carved into the stone were 4 words in medieval Latin: non morimur transimus. We do not die, we transform. What makes this even more intriguing is how often the Church turned a blind eye. Not always, of course. Some bishops protested, a few arrests were made, but more often than not, the ex-Templars were left alone so long as they kept quiet. This selective blindness has led some researchers to suspect quiet deals made behind closed cathedral doors. After all, an enemy in exile is dangerous, but a hidden ally with debts to repay, that's just politics. Yet transformation came with risks. Fragmentation, for one. Without a central temple or named Grand Master, these scattered cells developed independently. Some grew more mercantile, others more mystical. In Portugal, the focus was on navigation and cartography. In Scotland, on military alliances and silent protection pacts. In Venice, naturally, it was trade and influence. But they shared certain codes, certain expectations, a behavioral DNA that linked them across borders. There's evidence that by the 1350s, representatives from these groups were meeting in neutral cities, often disguised as merchant guilds or charitable foundations. The records are scarce, but one Venetian docket refers cryptically to a convocazione dell'assenza, the convocation of absence. The phrasing itself is a kind of joke, the kind secret societies seem to love, a meeting that no one attends, a vote where all are counted, and an agenda made entirely of silence. But here's the strange, almost poetic part: they never tried to resurrect the Templars. Not really. No new Red Crosses, no declarations, no Second Crusades. They didn't want to rebuild the cathedral. They wanted to become the air inside it, essential, invisible, and impossible to trap. And in doing so, they created a template, an operating system, if you like, for how power could function in the shadows. A playbook that didn't rely on armies or thrones, but on networks, quiet loyalty, strategic debt, long-term influence traded like gold. A system where a whisper could change the course of a dynasty, and no one would know whom to thank or blame. Some call this paranoid fantasy, others a misreading of scattered clues. But consider this: in multiple royal lineages across Europe, you'll find sudden marriages, untraceable advisors, and unexpected financial bailouts that align almost perfectly with known ports of Templar escape. Perhaps that's coincidence. Or perhaps even stripped of title and land, the Brothers of the Temple kept their most powerful asset, the ability to operate in the gray. And once you master that space between what is seen and what is suspected, you don't need castles anymore. You don't need banners. You just need time. In the chaotic aftermath of their dissolution, the scattered remnants of the Templars faced a brutal choice: vanish, beg for absolution, or adapt. And for those who reached the windswept highlands of Scotland, adaptation came not in the form of penance, but purpose. It's easy to forget that in 1314, Scotland itself was a political exile of sorts, excommunicated, rebel-held, at odds with Rome. It was the perfect hiding place. And if you believe the whispers, it didn't just offer them refuge, it gave them revenge. Robert the Bruce, warrior king and excommunicated outlaw, had every reason to welcome the outcasts. According to Scottish chronicles, the Battle of Bannockburn saw an unusual cavalry charge on its final day, an armored force that emerged late, struck with surgical timing, and then vanished into the mist. Contemporary accounts mention knights clad in white who bore no banner. No one could say who they were. But the timing was impeccable. The English lines shattered, Scotland held. And some historians now wonder if this wasn't just divine luck, but divine intervention of a very earthly kind. Whether or not former Templars directly fought at Bannockburn remains unproven, but what's far less disputable is the curious rise in land ownership and noble marriages involving foreign knights in the years that followed. Estates passed into the hands of men with no known Scottish bloodline. Charters signed in unusual Latin dialects. Abbeys given quiet protection by warriors with no crest. It wasn't obvious, but it wasn't subtle either. The newcomers left traces not loud, but deliberate. One of the most enigmatic sites tied to this theory is Rosslyn. Yes, the one that would later become tangled in Renaissance mysteries and modern novels. But back in the 14th century, it was just a quiet chapel funded by the Sinclair family, staunch allies of Robert the Bruce. And the Sinclairs, rather curiously, had just acquired new stonemasons from the continent. These builders brought with them esoteric designs, symbolic geometries, and a curious obsession with underground chambers. The blueprints of Rosslyn suggest more than faith, they suggest a blueprint for secrecy. Take the carving of the knights riding two to a single horse, an unmistakable nod to the original Templar seal. Or the star patterns mapped across the vaulted ceilings, arranged not to reflect contemporary Christian cosmology, but older forgotten alignments tied to Syrian mystery schools. These were not choices made by accident. They were declarations written in stone for those who knew how to read between the lines. And what of the bloodlines? That's where the story turns from architectural to dynastic. Within 2 generations of the alleged Templar arrival in Scotland, a handful of families rose to prominence with unusual speed. Their descendants would quietly hold sway over trade routes, diplomatic backchannels, and ecclesiastical appointments. These families intermarried not with random peers, but with each other. Tight circles, shared coats of arms with subtle alterations, heraldic hints of old vows. A lion here, a cross there, and occasionally a serpent biting its own tail. Modern genealogists who've attempted to untangle these threads often find themselves running into abrupt stops, records missing names, altered baptismal dates left blank. One particular line, descending from a knight simply known as Guillaume l'Ombre, appears to branch into both Scottish and French nobility, though never officially recognized by either. Guillaume means William. L'Ombre means shadow, a placeholder name, or a warning. The Church, interestingly, made no effort to reclaim lands or rights from these families. Despite papal bulls outlawing the Templars, Scotland seemed to exist in a kind of tolerated limbo. Perhaps Rome was content to ignore what it could not control. Or perhaps, as some suggest, the price of silence had already been paid, possibly in relics, in secrets, or in something more precious, access. Because Scotland wasn't just a backwater, it was a strategic gateway. From there, ships could pass to Ireland, to Norway, even to the icy edges of Iceland. It allowed for the movement of people, parchment, and coin, free from prying eyes. The Shadow Order, if it existed, could have used this as its staging ground, its heart beating beneath fog and pine. One particularly obscure reference comes from a 14th century Norse saga, which mentions the pale men of the Black Sun who brought letters sealed in blood and were welcomed by kings. It's poetic, it's vague, but it's enough to raise eyebrows, especially when paired with Scottish tax rolls that suddenly exempted certain estates despite no official grants. Who had the authority to bestow such invisibility? Of course, skeptics dismiss this all as legend layered over coincidence. Knights flee persecution, find sanctuary, and assimilate. That's the Occam's razor version. But it doesn't explain the coordinated rise of certain names, the preservation of certain rituals, or why centuries later Scottish Freemasonry would adopt symbols nearly identical to those once borne by the Templars. More curious still is the continuity of silence. Families that could have capitalized on the legacy for prestige, power, or papal favor chose not to. They didn't boast. They didn't write memoirs. They buried their knowledge as carefully as a relic beneath a holy altar. And perhaps that's the clearest signal of all. Real secrets don't shout. They wait. So now, standing at the edge of those highland fields, where wind still carries the scent of peat and memory, you might wonder, was it refuge they found, or was it resurrection? Far from the mist-veiled glens of Scotland, another branch of survival was unfolding under a different sky, warmer, saltier, and just as secretive. Portugal in the early 1300s presented a curious anomaly in the grand collapse of the Templars. While France hunted them and England quietly disposed of them, The Portuguese crown did something unexpected. It absorbed them. Not in name, of course. That would have been heresy. But in function, in privilege, in structure, absolutely. King Denis of Portugal, often nicknamed the Farmer King for his love of agriculture, was not a man to waste good soil or seasoned knights. While Philip IV of France incinerated leadership and seized property, Denis negotiated. With Rome breathing down his neck, he couldn't openly defy the papal decree. So he danced with it. In 1319, just 7 years after the official dissolution of the Templar order, Denis petitioned the Pope to allow the formation of a new order, the Order of Christ. The timing was suspicious. The structure was familiar. And the leadership, well, let's just say, they bore more than a passing resemblance to the very men who had once worn the Red Cross. It was a resurrection in all but name. The Church, perhaps exhausted by France's drama, relented. The Order of Christ was born, or rather reborn. What emerged from this paper-thin disguise was a remarkable metamorphosis. The Knights didn't just survive, they evolved. Freed from the pretense of crusading, the new order turned its eyes westward and seaward. Portugal was on the brink of something vast, uncharted waters, unnamed lands, and the Order of Christ became its secret engine. The shift was almost poetic, from swords to sails, from sanctuaries to stars. Former warriors became navigators, or perhaps they always were, just waiting for a broader map. Under the banner of the Order of Christ, Portugal launched expeditions that would reshape the world. And at the helm of many of these voyages were men tied by blood or by vow to that ancient brotherhood. Henry the Navigator, Portugal's famed prince of exploration, was not just a royal. He was the Grand Master of the Order of Christ. Under his leadership, the order funded ships, trained pilots, and created nautical charts that would become the envy of Europe. The Red Cross of the Templars, slightly modified but unmistakable, flew boldly on the sails that cut through African winds and Indian tides. It was no longer a symbol of Jerusalem. It had become a compass rose pointing toward conquest. What's particularly intriguing is how quietly this all happened. The Portuguese did not boast of their Templar inheritance. They did not enshrine the legacy in monuments or songs. They let it dissolve into the salt air, dispersing like incense. Yet within their records, the influence lingers. Grants of land to brothers of the cloth of Christ. Titles passed from unnamed predecessors. Naval academies founded on rituals that mirrored earlier Templar chapters, ranks, vows, secrecy. There's an obscure codex found in the Azores, badly water-damaged, its ink faded to the color of bruises, that lists a series of navigational guardians, each sworn to uphold the light of the temple through the darkness of the sea. It's apocryphal, of course, probably a later invention, but it carries that unmistakable scent of truth coated in myth. Even more curiously, while other nations treated their orders as relics, Portugal's remained active, flexible, functional, and above all, useful. The Order of Christ continued issuing commands well into the 16th century. It funded missions, it managed estates, and in the margins of its financial ledgers are symbols that appear nowhere else: geometric spirals, twin pillars, suns enclosed in squares. These aren't decorations, they're ciphers. And if the Order of Christ was merely a continuation, it begs a question. No one seems eager to answer. What exactly did they keep from the old order? Did they carry relics, scrolls, bloodlines? Or was the real treasure something more intangible? Methods, alliances, codes of operation that allowed a group of former knights to remain deeply embedded in the power structures of a new age. There's one documented incident rarely cited involving a Portuguese ship detained off the coast of Naples in 1433. When searched, The captain produced a letter of passage signed not by the king, but by a guardian of the 12. The contents of the hold included religious manuscripts in Syriac gold ingots, stamped with an ankh, and a single wax-sealed scroll with the imprint of a cross potent. The scroll was never opened. It vanished into a vault in Rome. The captain released with apologies. It's easy to chalk all this up to romantic storytelling, but then look again at the map of early European expansion. Spain's push was brutal, overt. England's involvement was sporadic, cautious. But Portugal was surgical. Always one step ahead on the waves, claiming routes, forming alliances with African kingdoms, navigating the spice corridors before anyone else understood their value. Either they had astonishing luck, or they had knowledge. And knowledge, as the old Templars knew, is the rarest coin of all. So if the order truly died in fire, then Portugal is the phoenix. But if it never died at all, if it simply changed its uniform, shifted its language, and swapped sword for sextant, then the Order of Christ was not an evolution. It was a camouflage. And in the hush of Portuguese libraries, where the dust falls undisturbed on vellum and wax, the trail remains. You just have to know where to look and what not to say out loud. The sword may have been buried, the cross defamed, but money always finds a way. If the Templars had any single gift more powerful than their piety, it was their unparalleled mastery of finance. Before they were warriors, they were innovators. They pioneered credit systems, letters of exchange, long-distance transfers, all centuries before modern banking would give these things names. And when the order collapsed in smoke and flame, their temples were seized, their knights scattered, but curiously much of their money didn't vanish. It moved. Quietly. Efficiently. Almost as if someone had planned it. What you need to understand is that medieval finance was chaos until the Templars came along. Pilgrims journeying to Jerusalem once had to carry heavy coin purses ripe for bandits. The Templars solved this by issuing promissory notes. A pilgrim could deposit funds in London and withdraw them in Acre, receiving a ciphered slip marked with Templar codes. It was revolutionary and incredibly difficult to trace. So when they were disbanded, the infrastructure was already in place for something many overlooked: decentralization. The official narrative says the Templar assets were absorbed by rival orders, namely the Knights Hospitaller. But the records don't add up. In fact, there's a notable shortfall between what the Templars were said to own and what the Hospitallers received. Vast estates disappeared into legal limbo. Monies vanished in transit. Even Philip the Mephorp, the ever-eager monarch who orchestrated the trials in France, recovered less than he expected. It's like trying to seize a mirage. And where did that wealth go? Northern Italy offers a clue. Not long after the Templar dissolution, a curious bloom of new banking houses appeared in cities like Siena, Lucca, and Florence. These weren't grand families, not yet. They were nimble, secretive, and exceptionally skilled. They traded not only in currency, but in information. One of the earliest examples, the Buonsignori of Siena, emerged seemingly overnight, their ledgers full of cryptic shorthand and foreign transfers. There are entries in those books, still preserved in fragments, that mention Casa Rosa and Custodi del Tempo. Red House. Guardians of Time. Strange labels for ordinary transactions. Even more telling is Bruges. This Flemish city, long a sleepy trade town, suddenly became a central node in Europe's financial web. By the late 1300s, it was flooded with money changers, insurers, and foreign accounts. Anonymous investors backed trading guilds with near-clairvoyant insight into maritime risk. Some believed the missing Templar funds were funneled here, fragmented across dozens of fronts, laundered through wool timber and shipping ventures. No names, no banners, just influence. A parchment discovered in 1873 known as the Ledger of Van Eyck records a consortium simply referred to as I Custodi. Its members were granted profit shares, but required to remain nameless. The rules were strict. No bloodlines, no public roles, no mention of past titles. And yet, curiously, each entry begins with the same phrase, servants of the temple, yet not of stone. This wasn't just banking. It was a philosophy, a code. They had learned that buildings burn, but networks endure. And what is money, if not the ultimate network? Let's not forget Venice. The Maritime Republic thrived on layered loyalties. Templar survivors, especially those with nautical experience, found easy integration here. Ships changed flags overnight. Fortunes shifted with every tide. One name, Alvis da Moneta, appears repeatedly in both Venetian and Genoese ledgers, always tied to foreign investments, always using a stylized cross as his sigil. Some suspect it wasn't a name at all, but a title. Da Moneta, of money. And there's the curious case of the Red Rooms in Genoa. These were private salons where high-value transactions took place. Guards were never present. The only security was silence. Meetings were sealed with a gesture, right hand to left shoulder, then heart, then forehead. Recognize it, it's a variation of the old Templar vow. Or so some claim. To this day, historians argue over how much of this is real and how much is myth layered over a complex truth. But the patterns persist. Clusters of financial power emerging in just the right places. Quiet actors with no clear origin. Families who rise and fall without a single chronicler noting their names, yet whose seals appear across continents. Even in the realm of interest rates, once condemned by the Church as usury, a shift occurred post-Templar. The taboo softened. Loans became tools of statecraft. Monarchs borrowed heavily from these new houses, and in return policies changed, wars were funded, and certain ports remained untouched. Influence without visibility. It's the oldest trick in the illuminated playbook. One detail often overlooked comes from Avignon. When the papacy relocated there in the 14th century, it became unusually dependent on external financiers. Not all of them were known. Not all of them were clerical. But several of the larger loans came with strange conditions, one insisting that certain Eastern libraries remain sealed for 100 years. That's not a banking term. That's a legacy clause. The question that lingers is this: did the shadow network evolve into modern finance? Or did it merely embed itself within it, the Rothschilds, the Fuggers, the Medici, all giants of capital in their own right? But what if their ascent was aided, even gently nudged, by predecessors whose names were erased long before the first ledger was signed? And if the old Templar hand still moves through these systems, then it's not in the form of crusading armies or holy relics. It's in spreadsheets, in offshore accounts, in shell companies, quiet, patient, untraceable. So when we talk about the Templars' treasure, maybe it was never gold or silver. Maybe the real treasure was the blueprint, the understanding that real power lies not in what you hold, but in what others owe you. And if that's true, then perhaps their greatest fortress was never built of stone. It was trust leveraged, fractured, and traded like currency, still standing invisibly behind every throne. If the Templar order survived through Portugal's sails and Italy's banks, then their next move was subtler still. It wasn't carved in stone or penned in blood, but painted, inked, etched, encoded into canvases and copper plates that hung silently on the walls of scholars, kings, and alchemists. Art, as it turned out, became the perfect camouflage for a message only the initiated could see. And no figure has drawn more suspicion in this quiet theater of codes than Albrecht Dürer, the man whose hand it's been argued may have carried a compass shaped by shadows. Dürer, the son of a goldsmith, was no simple portraitist. He was a polymath, a man of numbers as much as of faces. His works bristle with mathematical proportion, esoteric geometry, and riddles so dense that scholars still haven't fully decoded them. Melancholia, for instance, remains one of the most studied and misunderstood images in art history. A brooding angel, a magic square tools scattered like clues across a workbench of despair. But what if it wasn't just a lament of genius? What if it was a map? Look closely. The balance, the hammer, the keys, all items that appear in Templar rituals. The polyhedron, unnaturally angled, faceted in ways that defy standard perspective, has no known equivalent in architecture or nature, but bears resemblance to dodecahedrons used in Roman surveying. And the magic square, it adds to 34 in all directions, but the numbers 15 and 14 are placed dead center, pointing, some believe, to the year 1514, not of a death, but of a resurrection. There's also the faint signature AD, which conveniently also reads as Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Or perhaps, the age of the order. What elevates the suspicion beyond idle conspiracy is Dürer's network. He traveled not only across the Germanic states, but to Venice, to the Low Countries, and to courts where former Templar sympathizers still pulled strings behind the drapes. His journals mention meetings with men of peculiar habits, brothers in silence as he called them, who gifted him rare pigments and geometrical manuscripts. These were not ordinary patrons. They came unannounced, and they asked no portraits in return. In Nuremberg, where Dürer worked and lived, there existed a quiet fraternity of intellectuals, artists, mathematicians, astrologers who shared a particular fascination with sacred geometry. Their gatherings, though not public, are referenced obliquely in correspondence between workshop apprentices and cathedral builders. One letter reads, "The architect returns this week. The temple is in him." That architect, it's assumed, was Dürer. Then there's the curious case of his etching known as the Knight Death and the Devil, a mounted warrior, bearded, armored, unbothered by the grinning specters that flank him. Critics have long interpreted this as a symbol of Stoic virtue, but to those who've studied Templar symbology, the resemblance is uncanny. The cross upon the sword, the positioning of the horse's hooves, the folded banner beneath the rider's knee, inscribed with what appears to be a hidden sigil when viewed under angled light. Some have argued that Dürer was merely echoing the anxieties of his age-plague war theological fracture. But these images feel less like echoes and more like memos, instructions even. A kind of visual steganography, secrets hidden not in what the eye sees, but in how it is forced to interpret. There's also the matter of the codices he left behind, sketches filled with spirals, architectural fragments, and annotations in an artificial Latin-German hybrid that mimics encryption techniques used in Templar-era documents. One margin note translated roughly reads, "From wood and word, we shape the hidden stair." It's poetic, but it also hints at function. That art could serve as a stairway, a vessel for continuity, a coded staircase from the past to the present. Now, to be fair, and let's be fair, none of this proves Dürer was a member of some surviving Templar network. But that's not really the point. What matters is this: if a shadow order sought to communicate across generations without leaving obvious trails, what better method than through the hands of those who were already paid to render symbolism in plain sight? And if art was the new altar, Dürer may have been its first high priest. There's also precedent for this kind of work. The Hermetic tradition, which gained traction during Dürer's lifetime, was rooted in the idea that hidden knowledge could be embedded in symbols waiting for the right mind or bloodline to unlock it. The Templars too were accused of esoteric practices, not worship of idols necessarily, but of strange symbols, of rituals that blurred the line between sacred geometry and forbidden science. And here, tucked between brush strokes and copperplate lines, is a new kind of temple. One without walls, one carried in the mind. Scholars still debate Dürer's connection to any underground order. Some label it romantic nonsense. Others note the curious longevity of his prints in aristocratic libraries tied to former Templar strongholds. Whatever the truth, it's clear that he painted more than he showed. He coded more than he confessed. And if he was indeed a messenger, then his audience was not the masses, it was the network. The ones who would know what the folded cloth meant. Who would see not a melancholy angel, but a warning, a location, a vow remembered. Because sometimes a map doesn't show roads, it shows ideas, and in the spaces between Dürer's lines and the angles that don't quite fit, and the expressions that say too much with too little, something ancient stirs. Not gone, not erased, just resting, waiting to be read. There's a particular kind of silence that speaks volumes, and when it comes to the fate of the Templars, some of the loudest silences came from the thrones of Europe. Not all kings sharpened the knives. Not all courts celebrated the purge. In fact, a few royal houses acted with suspicious discretion, sheltering certain individuals, delaying inquisitions, or conveniently losing property that should have been confiscated. These weren't acts of mercy. They were investments, silent alliances. Because behind closed doors, power isn't about loyalty, it's about leverage. After the papal dissolution in 1312, most rulers followed the script: condemn, confiscate, move on. But in England, Edward II took an oddly hesitant approach. While Philip IV of France had already roasted de Molay to ash, Edward spent months debating whether the charges held any weight. It took multiple papal letters increasing in urgency and exasperation before he finally authorized arrests. And even then, many of the accused were treated well. Some were merely retired. Others disappeared. One curious case involves a man named Richard de Hales, a mid-ranking Templar in York, who was allegedly detained, then quietly released into the custody of an unnamed noble. He vanishes from the record thereafter, except for a brief mention in a household account of the Earl of Lancaster, listed only as the silent steward. No wage, no duties, no further explanation. Across the Channel, Spain tells a different story. In Aragon and Castile, the Templars were investigated but never truly dismantled. Trials were held, yes, but the findings were soft, conveniently inconclusive. Some of the accused were even reinstated to clerical positions. The properties temporarily seized, then gradually leased out to friends of the crown. It's as if the trials were performed for optics, while behind the curtain, the machinery kept humming. Portugal, of course, you already know. But even in places less openly favorable like Hungary or Poland, records show a pattern: certain lords absorbed entire estates without any trace of conflict, employing former Templars as advisors, engineers, or pilgrimage guides. In one Polish ledger dated 1327, a royal payment is listed to a Saxon brother for services rendered at the Temple of the South. There was no such temple, at least not officially. So why the favoritism? Why the selective memory? One answer may lie in debt. By the time of their suppression, the Templars were creditors to almost every crown in Europe. Their records, many now lost, indicated vast networks of loans, military funding, and war chests stored for emergencies. The kings owed them far more than they could repay. In burning the order, Philip IV not only eliminated the debt, but obscured its paper trail. But other monarchs weren't so bold. They feared the consequences of severing ties with a group that had been for generations the economic backbone of their armies. Another reason: information. The Templars didn't just hold lands and gold. They held secrets. Maps, blackmail inventories of relics, coded correspondences, even letters never meant for daylight. Monarchs may have seen them as dangerous, but also useful. Better to keep them close under new names, perhaps, than risk those secrets falling into rival hands. Some researchers point to the rapid rise of certain courtiers in the years following the order's dissolution. Men with no lineage, no visible merit, suddenly given lands and titles. In Burgundy, one such figure, Etienne Noir, was gifted a walled estate, despite having no documented history before 1312. His seal bore a black cross, overlaid with a crescent moon. When asked about his origins, he reportedly answered, "I serve a throne without a crown." There's also the question of marriage. Several noble houses in England and Spain intermarried with families whose patriarchs had once been accused Templars. These unions were rarely celebrated, rarely mentioned in court poetry or song, and yet their children ascended to prominence. Some even became royal advisors trusted with war strategy and foreign negotiation. Bloodlines, it seems, were quietly rewritten, folding former enemies into the genetic future of the throne. The church knew this, of course, but its hands were tied. Papal power was waning. Secular rulers were asserting dominance, and enforcing Templar suppression meant confronting the very kings the Vatican needed to placate. Better to let the matter drift into selective memory. One particular incident buried in Vatican correspondences details a complaint lodged by a French bishop in 1339. He reported that the Duke of Brittany had retained men of the temple under foreign titles and was using them to collect tithes independent of church oversight. The Pope's response: silence. No bull, no reprimand. The complaint disappears into the archive like a stone into deep water, and so the network adapted. Without banners or official chapters, it became something else, an appendage to royal power. Not quite within it, not quite outside it, a utility, a whisper, the very definition of plausible deniability. These weren't knights anymore. They were fixers, brokers, ghosts in tailored robes. Even centuries later, you can trace the shape of their influence in odd places. A crown that shifts hands quietly without revolt. A treaty that favors one nation's interests without explanation. A line of succession altered at the last moment. Each event dismissed, of course, as politics. But beneath the ink and signatures lies a question: who truly benefits? Perhaps the answer isn't a who, but a what. An order not gone, but integrated. Not public, but powerful. Thriving not in temples of stone, but in the corridors behind the throne. Of all the whispered names tangled in the mythos of Templar survival, one recurs with a peculiar persistence: the Priory of Sion. A name that dances between fact and forgery, scripture and scandal. A name entangled in bloodlines, parchments, and labyrinthine genealogies. It's the kind of puzzle that seems tailor-made to confuse, which, let's be honest, is usually the point. But underneath the layers of invention and literary embellishment, a strange pattern emerges. One that suggests the priory may not have been the originator of a secret tradition, but rather the carrier of one. First, let's be clear, much of what the public knows about the Priory of Sion comes from the 20th century, Pierre Plantard forged documents and bestsellers that turned symbols into spectacle. But the real story, the story that matters, starts centuries earlier. In obscure monastic records predating Plantard's flair for fiction, there are scattered references to a brotherhood bearing that name, quiet references, almost embarrassed to mention them. But they're there. In a 1608 ecclesiastical inventory from Languedoc, there's mention of Les Frères de Sion occupying a cloister near Rennes-le-Château. The abbey, long since demolished, reportedly held manuscripts of foreign script and Eastern tongue. The record notes that the order paid no tithe, bore no arms, and observed silence. Curious. But more telling is the footnote. They claimed no lineage but guarded one. That alone is enough to raise eyebrows in certain circles. So what was the priory really, if not the origin of a conspiracy, then perhaps the protective wrapping? A vessel, a veil, something deliberately designed to obscure rather than reveal. It wouldn't be the first time a secret society embedded itself within another. The Templars, after all, were expert at layers. Public ritual wrapped around hidden meaning. Symbols with surface explanations and buried intent. If a post-dissolution network wanted to survive undetected slipping into the robes of a fringe religious sect, would be perfect cover. And if that sect already had a reputation for eccentricity, even better. No one takes seriously the group everyone laughs at. Now consider this, the priory's alleged goal was not wealth or war, but preservation, specifically of a sacred bloodline. A claim often waved away as pseudo-history, but let's pause. Because we've already seen that the Templar network was obsessed with safeguarding particular individuals, children of noble houses, heirs to unknown fortunes, names erased from lineages. Could the priory have been the arm of the order tasked with protecting blood while others guarded treasure or trade routes? In a parchment dated 1771 discovered beneath a collapsed altar in the Pyrenees, a diagram was found, an interlocking set of circles with a triangle at its heart. The circles bore Latin names Portus Sanguis Silentium. Port, blood, silence. It's not a diagram of theology, it's logistics. The theory goes like this: after the fall of the Templars, the network splintered into 3 operational arms. One managed escape and transport coastal routes, hidden ships, safe houses. One tracked and preserved genealogical lines recording marriages, births, and deaths across noble houses. And the third ensured silence. Control of information, manipulation of records. Some believe the Priory of Sion was the second arm. Not a myth, but a ledger. And if you go looking for patterns, they emerge in the oddest places. Nobles with missing ancestry between the 14th and 16th centuries. Whole generations where documentation thins to a whisper. Yet those same houses remain powerful, stable, loyal to no one church, no one crown. Just in place. Anchored. Then there's the church architecture. Priory-linked chapels with floor plans shaped not in cruciform but in octagons echoing the Templar model. Frescoes that include double-headed eagles, stylized lilies, or anachronistic depictions of Jerusalem. Not always obvious, but layered in such a way that suggests knowledge passed down, not simply replicated. One of the more obscure clues comes from a carved keystone found in the ruins of Montségur site of the Cathar Last Stand. The stone, long thought lost, resurfaced in a private collection in Vienna. It bears the image of a rose in full bloom, but with one petal folded inward. Underneath, a Latin phrase, sub rosa sanguis servatur. Beneath the rose, the blood is kept. That's either medieval poetry or a mission statement. Of course, critics argue that the priory is a modern fabrication, a hoax retrofitted to give old stones new glamour. And sure, the Plantard forgeries muddy the water. But water only muddies when something stirs it. So the real question is, why now? Why then? And why does the same web of family symbols and silence keep surfacing, no matter how far back you look? Some argue the priory was never meant to be known, that its sudden appearance in modern lore was a mistake or perhaps a distraction. an intentional release of a decoy story to obscure a deeper truth. Leak a few fragments, give them some sparkle, let the world chase shadows while the real work continues unnoticed. Because if the Templar network truly adapted, it wouldn't have left itself exposed. It would have shrouded itself in harmless mystique, a paper order, a legend, a riddle designed to be misread. And if that's true, then the Priory isn't the answer, it's the question. A signal meant only for those still listening. Not to reveal history, but to mark where it's been edited. For an institution that spent centuries mastering the art of control, of curating doctrine, purging heresy, and refining the machinery of orthodoxy, the Vatican's selective amnesia around the Templars is almost theatrical. There's the condemnation. Yes. The bull that dissolved the order. The trials, the transcripts, the confessions won under flame and fear. But then, curiously, there's what wasn't done. What wasn't erased. What was quietly shelved, sealed, or forgotten on purpose. And when it comes to a group as powerful and peculiar as the Templars, that silence feels less like oversight and more like strategy. Let's start with the Chinon parchment, a document buried in the Vatican's secret archives for centuries, only rediscovered in 2001. It reveals that Pope Clement V had in private absolved the Templar leadership of heresy. Yes, you heard that right. The same pope who publicly disbanded the order had also, in a hidden record, cleared them of spiritual wrongdoing. Why was it guilt, or was it leverage keeping a door cracked just in case? Because while Philip IV of France burned Templars and seized their wealth, Clement V played a different game. He moved the papacy to Avignon, closer to French influence but farther from Rome's traditional centers of resistance. It was during this so-called Babylonian captivity that a flurry of curious decisions were made. Templar records that should have been destroyed were instead retained for ecclesiastical study. Names of affiliated clergy were left off execution lists. Some properties weren't absorbed into the Hospitallers, but remained in ambiguous status managed by monastic orders that never officially claimed them. One such estate, Santa Maria di San Croce near Parma, remained untouched for over 100 years. When it was finally surveyed in the 1500s, the cellar contained crates of documents all sealed with wax bearing the Templar cross. Most of those documents were quietly transferred to Vatican hands, their contents still classified. Even more intriguing are the inventories. After the suppression, church authorities were supposed to catalog and redistribute all Templar holdings. Yet certain items were marked with a symbol, an inverted triangle next to their description. What did it mean? There's no official explanation. But in internal correspondence between curial officials, there are references to items designated for discreet custody. In other words, too dangerous to destroy, too useful to display. Among them were said to be star charts written in Syriac stone fragments, etched with ciphers and volumes catalogued only as sermones tardiores, the late sermons. One archivist later described them cryptically as discussions of heaven, but with too much geometry. That's either a strange metaphor for heresy or a mathematical key to something much older than Christianity itself. Now, here's where it gets stranger. In the 15th century, Pope Nicholas V began a quiet project, the reorganization of ancient manuscripts from across Christendom. Under his direction, scribes translated Greek, Arabic, and Hebrew works into Latin, many of them apocalyptic or esoteric in nature. One batch was labeled Documenti Templari Securati Templar Security Documents. That phrase should have raised red flags. But instead of being purged, they were filed under restricted theological inquiry. Somewhere between reverence and repression, the Vatican built a vault within a vault, a system for holding the very knowledge it once condemned. not just the Templars' property, but their thoughts, their rituals, their way of seeing the world. Ideas that weren't just dangerous, they were competitive. Ideas that allowed ordinary men to challenge the authority of both king and pope using nothing more than numbers maps and a peculiar kind of silence. There's even evidence that certain popes remained sympathetic to the Templar legacy. Pius II, a former humanist scholar, once referred obliquely in a private letter to those who defend Christ through charts, not swords. Later, Leo X, yes, the Medici Pope, expanded funding to monasteries in former Templar regions, citing defensive necessity, though no conflict was occurring. The implication, someone was still guarding something. Or someone. And then there's the artwork. Within the Vatican itself are several tapestries and frescoes that include subtle Templar iconography. A kneeling knight in white robes always off to the side, never named. Crosses worked into the borders of saintly scenes where they don't belong. One particularly odd painting hidden in the sacristy of a little-used chapel shows a bearded man, eyes closed, hands extended not in prayer, but in oath. Behind him, a stone circle and the faint outline of a ship. No plaque, no attribution, just there. You begin to wonder, was the Church trying to forget the Templars, or trying to remember them differently? And then we come to the core question: why keep any of it? Why preserve documents, relics, and ritual fragments from a condemned order, unless just perhaps they weren't condemned in every room? Unless certain factions within the Church saw value in keeping the flame alive in a controlled hearth, far from public sight. One retired Vatican librarian once said off record, "We don't destroy heresy, we study it. Because sometimes yesterday's heretic is tomorrow's doctrine." It was a joke. Probably, but maybe not. So when you walk the cool, echoing halls of the Vatican past the locked doors and marble guardians, remember this: the silence of the Church is never empty. It's full of choices, of secrets left intact, not because they were forgotten, but because someone somewhere thought they might still be needed. And in the heart of that silence, the Templars wait. Not in defiance, not in vengeance, just in storage. The thread begins subtly, almost as a coincidence. A compass and square etched above a cathedral door. A Latin phrase concealed beneath the foundation stone of a Masonic lodge. A series of gestures, silent, precise, that mirror those once practiced by men who called themselves knights but never signed their names. The further you peer into the rituals and architecture of early Freemasonry, the more that echo grows louder. And by the time you reach the 18th century, the resemblance is no longer subtle. It's shouting. Let's be clear up front, the historical link between the Templars and Freemasonry is hotly debated, and no smoking parchment has surfaced to prove a direct lineage. But the circumstantial evidence forms a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Both groups operated with ranks and initiation rituals. Both prized symbols over speech, and both structured their organizations with cells that could survive independently should the center collapse. Coincidence maybe, or maybe inheritance. One of the earliest lodges in Scotland, Kilwinning Lodge No. 0, has roots that stretch deep into the 1100s, long before the rise of formal Freemasonry. It sat just miles from former Templar lands, and its earliest records hint at traditions that predate guild-based stonemasonry. There's a reference to the Watchers of the Fifth Light, a term with no clear architectural meaning, but which aligns curiously with Templar apocalyptic numerology, specifically references to the fifth trumpet, the fifth seal, the fifth angel. A nod to prophecy or simply borrowed language passed along the surviving threads. Now consider Rosslyn Chapel, again, not as a standalone mystery, but as a bridge. Constructed in the mid-1400s, it contains not just Templar iconography, but carvings that match Masonic tools, rituals, and symbols. The apprentice pillar, the fallen angel, the checkerboard floor. Even the arrangement of the columns appears to mirror Kabbalistic interpretations, later absorbed into Masonic esoterica. The builders left no key, no explanation, but they left just enough geometry to imply an encrypted legacy. Then there's the matter of the old charges documents, outlining the rules and myths of operative Masons transitioning into speculative symbolic societies. One version, the Cook manuscript, speaks of secrets brought from the East and from Holy Lands. Another references a mysterious teacher from the temple whose name is omitted. These aren't definitive proofs. They're winks. Winks left by scribes who knew that preservation sometimes required a veil of fiction. But the strongest clue isn't a name or a symbol, it's a principle. The Freemasons were revolutionary in one very particular way. They operated independently of church authority. In an age where spiritual oversight was total, that was more than unusual, it was dangerous. Just like the Templars before them, they created a framework in which men of different creeds, classes, and kingdoms could unite under a code. Loyalty to the brotherhood above all. And that brotherhood had its own rules, its own cosmology. It emphasized architecture not as labor but as metaphor. The building of inner temples, the pursuit of light. All motifs whispered in older Templar texts, particularly those recovered in Spain and Languedoc, which describe a path through stone to truth beyond form. Poetic nonsense, perhaps. But when repeated in Masonic initiation ceremonies 400 years later, it starts to feel like a liturgy rediscovered. There's also the strange tale of the rite of strict observance, an 18th century Masonic offshoot that openly claimed descent from the Knights Templar. Its members wore red crosses, conducted elaborate initiations in candlelit chapels, and referred to their leader as the unknown superior. It was ridiculed by some, feared by others, but its documents included genealogies, land records, and codes that matched known Templar formats. Eventually, it fractured. Its archives disappeared into private collections, but it left behind a question if they were frauds. How did they know so much? And then we come to the French Revolution. Freemasons played significant roles in it, philosophically, politically, symbolically. The overthrow of monarchy and church power in favor of brotherhood and rational law. That's not just Enlightenment thinking. That's Templar revenge repackaged in Enlightenment robes. The Templars had been betrayed by kings, silenced by popes. Their memory survived in whispers, and those whispers carried resentment. Not overt, not vengeful. Just architectural. Slowly, steadily building a new structure where no pope would rule and no king would command. You see it in the American colonies too. George Washington was a known Mason. So was Benjamin Franklin. Their lodges bore names like Temple of Solomon and carried banners that mirrored the old iconography of crusading knights. But their mission wasn't conquest, it was construction. Of nations, of ideals, of networks. And that's where the comparison deepens. Because Freemasonry, like the Templars before them, was never just a society, it was a network. A structure that transcended geography. A toolkit for influence. A system that could be adopted, adapted, and passed along without ever revealing its true origin. Some historians argue that the connection is romantic fiction, Dan Brown dressed in velvet robes. But others point to the stubborn survival of certain phrases, hand signs, and geometries that shouldn't exist across such a vast chasm of time, unless they were carefully preserved. Not publicly, not ceremonially, but silently. So perhaps the Templars didn't become the Freemasons. Perhaps they became the soil from which Freemasonry grew, a substratum of ideas, rituals, and rebellion encoded in the very DNA of the system. Forgotten by most, remembered by design. Because real legacy isn't built in marble or stained glass. It's built in structure, in repetition, in the quiet assurance that no matter how many thrones fall, the blueprint endures. Florence, in the 15th century, was a city cloaked in contradictions. It birthed masterpieces while plotting assassinations. It sang hymns to God while laundering fortunes through parchment ledgers. And at the center of this glittering chaos stood the Medici family bankers, patrons, power brokers. To call them influential is an understatement. They were the nervous system of Renaissance Italy. But behind their meteoric rise lies a question that continues to itch at the margins of respectable history. How did they climb so far, so fast, and with such impunity? And more specifically, who helped them? And the Medici archives, impressive as they are, contain more omissions than answers. Early entries are filled with vague partnerships, obscure transactions, and records of funds that appear without origin. One 1423 ledger shows a foreign investment infusion that stabilizes the family's banking interests just before a regional downturn, an investment that comes with no recorded name, only a symbol, a twin circle intersected by a cross, not a Medici sigil, but one deeply familiar to anyone versed in Templar iconography. The Medici weren't knights, they weren't crusaders, they weren't even particularly devout despite commissioning cathedrals and sponsoring popes. What they were, however, was perfectly positioned, a banking family, willing to serve power, not question it. And if the surviving Templar network sought influence over thrones and tiaras without exposure, then the Medici offered the ideal Trojan horse. A family ambitious enough to touch the papacy, yet shrewd enough to keep their mouths shut. There's an obscure letter dated 1439 from Cosimo de' Medici to a Venetian associate preserved in fragmented form in a private German collection. In it, Cosimo thanks his northern patrons for their continued trust and silence. He also references the instructions from the older charter and encloses a gift, a ring inset with red enamel and a carved lamb. The Templar Lamb of God was not unknown in Florence, but rarely seen in jewelry. The letter ends with a curious phrase, per templum, non per corona. Through the temple, not the crown. That phrase appears again in a 15th century treatise on civic governance attributed to Marsilio Ficino, one of the Medici Circle's key philosophers. Ficino's manuscript is dense with Neoplatonist metaphors, but beneath the mystical language are passages about a hidden brotherhood older than kingdoms, which understands the management of gold and will outlast all princes. He never names the Templars. He didn't need to. And consider Lorenzo de' Medici il Magnifico. While art historians drool over his patronage of Botticelli and Michelangelo, political historians find something more curious. Lorenzo survived at least 3 assassination attempts, navigated the deadly Pazzi conspiracy, and emerged not just intact, but elevated. How his personal guard was uncommonly disciplined. His intelligence network spanned beyond Tuscany, and his financial decisions often seemed eerily prescient, as if someone was whispering from the shadows not just advice, but warning. One particular event cements the suspicion: the 1478 assassination attempt inside Florence's cathedral. Giuliano de' Medici was murdered. Lorenzo escaped with a superficial wound. In the aftermath, revenge was swift, almost too swift. The conspirators were hunted, tried, executed within days. But what's often missed is this: a man known as Brother Tommaso was arrested, then quietly released without trial. He was said to have appeared in Florence just weeks before the attack, speaking Latin, with a Burgundian accent, and carrying a ring inscribed with 1312. That year should ring familiar. No further trace of Tommaso exists in Florentine records, but Venetian customs logs note a man of similar description boarding a vessel bound for Lisbon later that month. And then there's the architectural flourish. Many Medici-funded structures, from the Basilica of San Lorenzo to the Palazzo Vecchio's secret chambers, feature anomalous carvings, crosses, roses, and spirals that seem more alchemical than Christian. One fresco in particular, hidden behind a false wall in the Medici chapel, depicts a man in white robes holding a cube standing beside a lion whose tongue is forked. Interpretations vary, but the image aligns with Templar allegories found in manuscripts from the Pyrenean monasteries, specifically those tied to rituals of oath and secrecy. All of this could be dismissed as coincidence, of course. Florence was full of symbolism. Renaissance minds loved their riddles. But when layered atop financial records, diplomatic alliances, and the mysterious resilience of the Medici family, through political storms that sank others, it begins to feel like more than clever design. It begins to feel like an arrangement in which a shadow order, survivors of suppression, masters of discretion, lent their network's knowledge and financial heft to a family willing to act as the public face of quiet power. A symbiosis. The Medici gained influence. The Templars, if they were still watching, gained cover. And what better place to anchor such a network than in Florence, the beating heart of Renaissance Europe, where gold flowed like wine and art offered the perfect screen for encoded messages. So perhaps the Medici were never the real players. Perhaps they were the pieces moved by a hand that refused to be seen. And if that's the case, then their legacy is not just of banking and basilicas, but of a pact written in silence, enforced through trust, and sealed with symbols carved just deep enough to last. They called themselves the Brothers of the Rosy Cross. Cloaked in allegory, shrouded in manifestos, they emerged not with swords, but with symbols, alchemical, astrological, mystical. The Rosicrucians, as they came to be known, exploded into the public imagination in the early 1600s with a flurry of strange texts, Fama Fraternitatis, Confessio Fraternitatis, and the chemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. Together, these documents spoke of secret orders, hidden wisdom, and a spiritual mission to transform Europe. Scholars argued over their meaning. Critics scoffed. But beneath the ornate metaphors and philosophical theater, a quieter suspicion took root that these weren't just mystical daydreamers. They were a resurfacing. To some, the Rosicrucians were dreamers born of the Reformation Protestant mystics pushing back against Catholic rigidity with science wrapped in myth. To others, they were a literary hoax, never real, just satirical fiction. But to a smaller circle of researchers, the question was more dangerous. What if they weren't new at all? What if they were a continuation? A torch passed silently from an older order burned in public centuries earlier, now reborn under a different name. Start with the structure. The Rosicrucians presented themselves not as a church or cult, but a brotherhood. They had no central temple, no visible leader, and no desire for recognition. Their very name, a rose and a cross, echoed with calculated ambiguity. A cross, of course, suggests Christian roots. A rose, however, implies secrecy, hidden beauty, blooming truth. Together, they signal a resurrection of ideas, if not identity. Their founding figure, Christian Rosenkreuz, was said to have traveled to the East, studied with sages, returned with sacred knowledge, and built a hidden tomb containing cosmic truths. A romantic tale. But replace Rosenkreuz with a displaced Templar knight, and the pattern sounds eerily familiar. Eastern influence, secrecy, coded symbols, buried archives. Not proof, but perhaps a parable for survival. Even their manifestos carry Templar fingerprints. The Fama Fraternitatis describes a network of individuals who remain hidden until the right time. It emphasizes moral reform, scientific enlightenment, and spiritual purity principles that mirror the internal codes found in surviving Templar rulebooks. There's also a curious line, "They shall be known by no other name than by the Brotherhood," a deliberate unnaming, an erasure designed to protect continuity. One German copy of the Fama housed in a private Saxon collection includes an inscription not found in other editions, Sanguis Antiquae in Floribus Novis, the blood of the old in the flowers of the new. That phrase doesn't belong to Rosicrucian tradition. It matches language found in a Templar scroll recovered from the Languedoc region, long thought apocryphal. Coincidence, perhaps. But even coincidences start to pile. Then there's the geographic overlap. The earliest Rosicrucian texts emerged from German-speaking lands regions that had quietly absorbed Templar refugees after 1312. While official church persecution faded, these territories offered just enough political fragmentation and intellectual curiosity to allow secret networks to fester and flourish. Alchemical societies, astronomical brotherhoods, and among them groups that claimed to guard ancient knowledge passed down from those who once served the light in silence. Notably, one early Rosicrucian circle called itself Custodes Arcanorum, guardians of the secret. That phrase in Latin matches a ciphered motto discovered on a lead seal in a former Templar estate near Bamberg. The seal was found beneath a hearthstone and bore the familiar 8-pointed star with initials that, when decoded, read CA, possibly meaningless, possibly the handprint of a ghost. Another overlap lies in their architectural metaphors. Rosicrucian texts often reference inner chambers, the invisible temple, and sacred geometry that builds the soul. These weren't casual poetic devices, they were deliberate echoes. The Templars, too, had described themselves as architects of both stone and spirit. The parallels aren't perfect, but the resonance is hard to ignore. Even critics of the Templar-Rosicrucian connection admit the philosophies feel compatible. Both traditions emphasize inner transformation, the guarding of higher truths, and a layered understanding of Scripture, one that includes both literal and symbolic interpretation. And both relied heavily on initiation, not admission by faith, but by test, a proving of worth, a passage through darkness to knowledge. Of course, skeptics argue that mystical orders tend to resemble one another because they draw from the same symbolic pool: alchemy, Hermeticism, Pythagorean codes. But what if that pool was fed by a single stream, a source buried deep, flowing quietly beneath the centuries? Not a lineage of blood, perhaps, but of methodology, of secrecy as structure, of knowledge passed not by proclamation, but preservation. And here's where it gets stranger. Some scholars believe the very purpose of the Rosicrucian manifestos was not to announce, but to test, to see who responded, to measure reaction. Several early recipients wrote back not with skepticism, but with recognition. One reply preserved in Basel includes the phrase, "We greet our brothers in return and remember the flame carried from the temple." Flame, temple, brotherhood. Too pointed to dismiss, too shadowed to prove. And perhaps that's the point. If a remnant of the Templar order had survived hidden, fractured waiting, what better way to reassert itself in a new age than through metaphor, through the language of transformation, not revolution? A cloak of roses around an iron cross. So maybe the Rosicrucians weren't the Templars reborn. Maybe they were just the next room in the same hidden house. A chamber built atop older stones, different flowers, same roots. when fire rains from the crown and thunder from the pulpit? Where does a hunted order go, not to the battlefield, not to the city, but to the cloister? Monasteries, those sleepy engines of silence, became far more than places of prayer in the decades after the Templar suppression. They became safe houses, transfer stations, vaults, not for gold necessarily, but for people, for scrolls, for memory, and perhaps for something even more enduring: infrastructure. The key was invisibility. Monasteries, particularly those aligned with the Cistercian and Benedictine orders, had long enjoyed a peculiar immunity. Isolated, self-sufficient, and largely left alone by local authorities, their rhythms of work and prayer rendered them almost invisible to the wider world, and in that invisibility, shadows could gather. Take Clairvaux Abbey, for instance, once overseen by Bernard of Clairvaux, the man who helped craft the Templar rule itself. By the mid-1300s, it had quietly acquired several parcels of land previously associated with nearby Templar commanderies. The transfers weren't recorded as purchases, nor were they assigned by royal decree. They simply occurred. One day, the Templars held the land. The next, the monks did, and no one asked questions. Elsewhere in Burgundy, a series of cloisters developed strange architectural anomalies: small windowless rooms with narrow slits for observation, reinforced doors with double bolts, underground passages connecting outbuildings to distant fields. All unusual for monastic design, but consistent with the kind of defensive adaptation a hunted network might make if forced to continue their operations under cover of chant and chime. These weren't military compounds, of course. They were shelters, transit hubs, communication points in a time before telegraphs and couriers. A fugitive could vanish into these stone arms, shaven and robed, and re-emerge months later in an entirely different region, reborn with a new name and a new purpose. And no one, not even the abbot, might know the full story. Because knowledge, like treasure, was compartmentalized. Just enough to fulfill the mission, never enough to risk the whole. Some abbeys developed coded liturgical calendars, feast days for saints who didn't exist, vespers held at off hours, a bell rung 3 times, then 2, then once, meaning a message has arrived. These weren't fabrications for modern novels. They're recorded in marginalia, scrawled beside psalms, tucked into herbalist journals and architectural surveys. Details too mundane to be forgeries, too consistent to be chance. There's a particular chapel in the Loire Valley long abandoned, where a faded fresco depicts a knight laying down his sword at the feet of a monk. Not unusual in theory, many knights retired to monastic life, but here the sword bears a cross patee, unmistakably Templar. And behind the monk, barely visible through the crumbling plaster, is the outline of a ship. A symbol not of surrender, but of continuation. The Cistercians are of particular interest. Their early ties to the Templars are well-documented spiritual fathers, architectural mentors, allies in faith and function. But in the decades after the Templar fall, several Cistercian monasteries flourished, while nearby economies collapsed. Donations increased, libraries expanded, and in more than one case they quietly acquired skilled laborers, stonemasons, surveyors, even blacksmiths, whose presence was never explained in the monastic rolls. One such abbey in northern Spain, Santa Maria de Huerta, retained records in a ciphered shorthand that took modern linguists decades to decode. Among the entries were instructions for construction projects that never occurred, and food requisitions far exceeding the number of residents. And then the occasional phrase, Ordo de subsilencio, the order of under silence, a term with no precedent in monastic vocabulary, but a perfect match for a clandestine cell structure. Even the Vatican seemed reluctant to probe too deeply. In 1382, a papal auditor assigned to survey monastic lands in Occitania reported unusual resistance at two former Templar sites, now operated by Benedictines. The monks delayed access, refused inventories, and in one case presented a deed signed not by a bishop, but by an anonymous guardian. The auditor's report was filed, then forgotten. The archives show no follow-up. Perhaps the most unsettling evidence comes not from Europe, but from an island off the coast of Malta. In the ruins of a 15th-century chapel abandoned before it was ever consecrated, archaeologists uncovered a sealed reliquary. Inside was no saint's bone, no holy fragment, but a rolled parchment listing names. Names tied to no noble house. Just titles: navigator, keeper, witness. The last line in Latin reads, "Here the veil is strongest," and beneath it, a symbol, two keys, crossed over an open book. Today, you can still visit some of these abbeys. They echo with the quiet dignity of faith. Bells ring, gardens bloom. Novices move through stone corridors unchanged by centuries. But occasionally, in the sub-basements or locked vestries, there are signs that things were once different. Iron latches on prayer stools, shelves built into walls sized not for Bibles, but scrolls. And in the margins of old hymnals, scribbled diagrams of star patterns, floor plans, and coded symbols. It's not proof of a conspiracy. It's proof of memory. Because if the Templar network survived, it needed anchor points, places that offered stability amid chaos. And what better anchor than a monastery bound by silence, protected by custom, and revered by all? So when you kneel beneath the cold arch of a forgotten abbey and listen for the chants of long-gone monks, remember not every prayer was to heaven. Some were signals, sent through stone, waiting still. England never burned with the same Templar fury that consumed France. The arrests came late. The trials were lukewarm. And when it was all said and done, the English crown didn't get quite as much treasure as expected. But what it did get quietly and with little fanfare was something more useful: relationships. Because while France turned the Templars into martyrs, England may have turned them into instruments. Let's rewind to the early 14th century. Edward II, son of the warrior king Edward I, was less a lion and more a lamb. Weak-willed, politically embattled, and deeply dependent on his inner circle, he was no match for the European powers around him. And yet, for all his ineffectiveness, his reign coincided with a strange moment: the absorption of ex-Templars into non-military roles throughout the countryside. Not prosecuted, not purged, just re-employed. Records show that dozens of former Templars were granted clerical positions, land stewardship roles, and even advisory titles under Edward's court. A few were sent to monasteries, a few were retired with dignity, and more than a few simply vanished from the rolls and reappeared in new posts under different names. One former knight, William de la More, once master of the Templars in England, was imprisoned, interrogated, and then released. No execution, no disappearance. Just a quiet fade. What's even more curious is what happened next. Over the next century, England witnessed an unusual trend: advisors with obscure backgrounds rising in proximity to the crown. Unlanded men suddenly influential. Unnamed donors financing cathedral repairs or military endeavors. Even more telling, during the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict drenched in betrayal, certain noble houses survived with uncanny consistency. The Neville family, for instance, whose branches spanned both York and Lancaster, maintained influence regardless of who wore the crown. Then there's the Tudors. Henry VII's rise from exile was improbable enough, but his reign was bolstered by foreign financiers and silent supporters, as early chronicles call them. These supporters left no names, but their wealth made the difference at Bosworth Field. The battle that ended Plantagenet rule may well have been tipped by money and counsel from a group that didn't care who won, only that they were owed. Evidence grows sharper in the Elizabethan era. Under Queen Elizabeth I, several of her closest confidants, Francis Walsingham, John Dee, and William Cecil, operated what can only be described as a proto-intelligence network. Espionage, ciphers, secret codes embedded in books and letters. It was a surveillance state centuries before the term existed. John Dee, Elizabeth's astrologer and alchemist, even signed his letters with a symbol 007. Yes, that's real. A symbol for eyes-only messages. And yes, Ian Fleming later borrowed it. But what matters isn't the Bond trivia, it's the method. The architecture of hidden influence. Secure correspondence, codenames, covert cells. A system uncannily similar to the Templar communication networks used during the Crusades, where runners carried encoded slips and only the Grand Master had the key. One strange link comes through the College of Arms. Officially tasked with maintaining heraldry, the college held an unusually tight grip on who could claim noble lineage. But in the 16th century, they also began granting coats of arms to certain foreign gentlemen of great discretion, including one individual named Guillaume de Sangray. No birth record, no estate, just a name that when translated means William of the Blood. The arms granted to him a red cross over black, quartered with a rose. Make of that what you will. Then there's the City of London itself, not just the metropolis but the Corporation of London, a legal entity that operates as a city within a city, immune from certain parliamentary controls. Within it lies Temple Church, still standing, still consecrated. Once the headquarters of the Templars in England, now a place of quiet worship for barristers and bankers. But beneath it, a crypt. A circle of stone knights lying in repose. Officially decorative, symbolic. But some of those effigies don't match any known knights. Their faces are unfamiliar. Their hands lie in positions not seen in typical funerary art. One even holds a scroll. And yes, skeptics say this is all just poetic interpretation. A quirk of history. But for a network built on obscurity, the very absence of clarity is part of the pattern. In more recent centuries, connections have continued to trickle. Families like the Cavendishes, Cecils, and Russells have held disproportionate sway in the British state. Members of these houses appear at key points in political evolution, from the Glorious Revolution to the founding of the Bank of England, to the establishment of the intelligence services. Many of them trace ancestry back to 14th century knights, whose titles should have ended with the suppression, but didn't. So was England's handling of the Templars, less about mercy and more about assimilation, not in the sense of preserving a chivalric order, but of harvesting a system of secrecy, structure, and transnational thinking that could be folded into the fabric of the crown. Because for all its supposed rigidity, the British monarchy has survived not through brute force, but through subtle adaptation. Rebranding, subcontracting power. And if the Templars survived anywhere not as a military order, but as a shadow, then perhaps it wasn't behind a throne at all. Perhaps it was beneath it. There are secrets, and then there are inconvenient secrets. The kind that can't be sealed away in a vault or burned on a pyre because they reside in the one place impossible to erase blood. Among the darker whispers surrounding the Templars' fall, none have lingered with more disquieting persistence than the suggestion that their real heresy had nothing to do with idols or secret rites, but everything to do with genealogy. That buried beneath their crusading zeal and banking genius was a dangerous possession knowledge of a bloodline. one that, if exposed, would threaten both thrones and the church itself. The rumor begins innocuously, as most do with a scroll. A document unearthed in the early 1800s near Montségur, long associated with the Cathars. It was brittle, barely legible, but referenced a name not found in any official register, a child of the vine hidden in the east of the royal root yet to bloom. The phrasing was strange, even poetic, but it sparked renewed interest among esoteric historians, particularly those already suspicious of the Templars' alleged Gnostic sympathies. Then came the Vatican archives. In 1993, a German scholar granted limited access to a sealed chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace, reportedly viewed an untranslated fragment of correspondence between a 14th-century inquisitor and Pope Clement V. The letter includes a troubling line: "They do not worship the devil holiness. They worship a blood no longer sanctioned." What that means is left unclear. But it's not the kind of sentence one invents lightly. There's also the curious case of the Rex Deus hypothesis, a theory long dismissed by mainstream historians, that a small number of noble families in Europe trace their lineage not just to royal houses, but to an earlier line altogether. A Semitic one. The Merovingians are frequently dragged into this theory, not because of solid evidence, but because of their early deference to unorthodox Christian sects and their abrupt fall from grace. The last Merovingian king, Dagobert II, was assassinated in circumstances that remain conveniently vague. His line, according to some, didn't end. It went underground. And the Templars operating in former Merovingian territory and known to guard genealogical documents may have become the stewards of that legacy. Their time in the Holy Land also raises questions. Templar missions weren't confined to warfare. They established contact with Eastern Christian sects, Islamic scholars, and Jewish communities. Among these exchanges, some researchers believe were genealogical records, family lines dating back centuries, including those of the Davidic and Hasmonean houses. One Templar document confiscated during the Paris trials and referenced in the trial transcripts allegedly refers to the line of the rose and includes instructions for protecting the vessel who bears it. Scholars argue over its meaning. Some call it allegory. Others are less convinced. If we follow this theory, and for now just imagine we do, it would explain a great deal about the strange precision of the Templar arrests. Philip IV didn't just move to dissolve the order, he moved to eradicate it overnight. No negotiations, no reforms, just fire and iron, almost as if he feared what they held, not as a threat to his wealth, but to his right to rule. After all, monarchs ruled by divine sanction. If someone could prove that their claim was false, or that a superior line existed, especially one with ties to a sacred or semi-sacred origin, it would upend the medieval world. The Church, too, had staked everything on singular authority. Apostolic succession, papal infallibility. If a different story of succession emerged, one rooted in blood not blessing it would collapse the entire structure. Of course, there's no definitive proof, just a chain of shadows. A 16th-century alchemical text from Prague de Sanguine Tranquillitatis speaks cryptically of the river's branch, hidden beneath stone, whose blood calls not to heaven, but to memory. In the margin, a Templar cross is drawn along with a 7-pointed star. Later annotations suggest the author believed a royal bloodline had been preserved, not through kingship, but guardianship raised in secrecy, intermarried with caution, and moved across Europe under the care of certain unnamed custodians. More concretely, several noble houses, particularly in southern France, northern Spain, and Portugal, have family trees with unexplained insertions. Children raised with noble rights, but no known paternal origin. Girls whose marriages were arranged with almost religious urgency, their dowries supplied by external patrons. In one case, a monastery in Navarre kept a book of daughters, a genealogical record, whose final pages were sealed with wax and stamped with a cross, potent again, unmistakably Templar. And then there's the secrecy, the truly peculiar silence. For a theory so potentially inflammatory, there's been remarkably little effort to publicly disprove it. No grand papal denouncement, no historical consensus formed around its absurdity, just a kind of embarrassed ignoring. As if to say, let sleeping bloodlines lie. To be fair, some scholars believe the entire idea is a clever metaphor. The bloodline represents knowledge, a philosophical inheritance, a code of thought passed down in veins not literal but ideological, that the Templars guarded not a person but a principle. But then you look again at the burial practices, the encrypted headstones, the careful preservation of relics in places with no strategic or religious value, and it starts to feel less like ideology and more like insurance, a living vault. If the Templars preserved a bloodline real or symbolic, it would explain their obsession with control, secrecy, and continuity. It would justify the urgency with which some monarchs protected them, while others tried to crush them. It would also explain why, centuries later, their story still haunts Europe's memory like a closed book no one dares reopen. Because if such a line exists, it isn't just history. It's a claim, a challenge, a spark. And in a world still ruled by names, that's a flame no one wants to see catch fire. Some monarchies flinched at the mention of the Templars. Others played both sides, shielding rogue knights in exchange for secrets or gold. But one family above all others seemed uniquely unfazed. The Habsburgs, Europe's most enduring imperial dynasty, didn't just tolerate the legacy of the Templars. They absorbed it. They wore it like armor, spoke of it in guarded metaphors, and if you know where to look, etched it into their castles and courts. It was never loud, never confessed, but always there like a faint watermark beneath the gilded surface of their empire. At first glance, there's little reason to suspect a connection. The Habsburg rise began just as the Templar order was crumbling. In 1273, Rudolf of Habsburg was elected King of the Romans, a generation before the infamous arrests in France. By the time Jacques de Molay burned, the Habsburgs had already begun stitching their influence across Central Europe. But here's where things get interesting. Unlike France or England, the Habsburg territories never became hotbeds of Templar persecution. Trials were rare, confiscations were minimal, and certain Templar estates in Austrian lands quietly transitioned not into church property, but into Habsburg-aligned noble holdings. One estate in particular, near what is now Wiener Neustadt, shows a sudden and unexplained change in administration around 1313. The previous Templar commandery becomes overnight a hunting lodge for a Frater Karl, a name with no noble lineage, no ecclesiastical title, and no surviving burial record. Local legend holds that Karl was a custodian of the Old Road, which historians have taken to mean a former knight granted asylum. And the lodge itself, built with stones from the original preceptory, many still bearing carved crosses, some inverted, others surrounded by concentric circles. That might be easily dismissed as coincidence, if not for the pattern. Across Habsburg territory, Austria, Bohemia, parts of Switzerland, and modern Slovenia, there emerged throughout the 14th and 15th centuries a network of chapels and civic buildings sharing strangely consistent design cues: octagonal rooms, double-headed eagles clutching keys, spiral staircases that lead to nowhere. These aren't quirks of Gothic architecture. They're signatures. And while the double-headed eagle would later become a central Habsburg motif, it originally belonged to another empire entirely Byzantium. Yes, but also cryptically, to several lesser-known Templar banners discovered in ruins along the southern French border. And then there's the family itself. The Habsburgs were famously obsessed with bloodlines. Their entire strategy revolved around dynastic marriages consolidating power, not through war, but through inheritance. Let others wage war, the saying went, you happy, Austria merry. But within this labyrinth of unions lie anomalies, marriages to women of unknown origin elevated to noble rank, without traditional documentation. One bride in the 1400s, referred to in records only as Domina 5, is said to have arrived from Aragon bearing scrolls and silence. Her coat of arms includes a rose and a tilted cross. That again might seem poetic, until you examine the imperial regalia. In several Habsburg portraits, notably those of Maximilian I, small adornments appear at the corners of the canvas, barely noticeable unless magnified. Tiny crosses. Not the traditional Christian kind, but stylized variants associated with esoteric orders: cross, potent Jerusalem cross, and one particularly curious emblem, 4 dots arranged in a square around a central rose. This last one appears carved into the throne room fireplace of Burg Kreuzenstein, a reconstructed medieval fortress once owned by the Habsburgs. Maximilian, by the way, was fascinated by chivalric orders. He commissioned the Weisskönig, a romanticized account of his lineage portraying him as a king, descended not from warlords, but from sacred knights. He also founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, a chivalric fraternity that, while ostensibly religious and imperial, carried within its statutes references to guardianship, eternal vows, and brotherhood without witness. A few scholars have noted similarities between the Fleece's induction ceremony and reconstructed Templar rites, including the use of a black veil, coded oaths, and symbolic references to the East. Why does this matter? Because it suggests something more than admiration. It suggests inheritance, not of relics perhaps, but of structure, of trust networks, of knowledge on how to rule across borders using symbols, loyalty, and layered allegiances. Consider the Habsburg control of the Holy Roman Empire, a fractured multilingual, multi-faith patchwork, held together not by brute force, but by bureaucratic acumen and symbolic cohesion. Who else before them had mastered transnational command in such a decentralized way? The Templars. Their commanderies spanned Christendom, but their loyalties remained internal. Their communication lines, codified, secure, independent of local authorities, allowed them to function above borders. The Habsburgs did the same, only with crowns instead of crosses. There's also an economic link. Several Habsburg banks in the 17th century were discovered to be operating with capital reserves from unknown origins. A Viennese audit in 1674 refers to a silent fund dating back to pre-Concordat holdings, likely meaning pre-Reformation. Within it, gold stamped with Arabic calligraphy and a ledger of land rents from southern Portugal, of all places. How does Portuguese land revenue end up underwriting a Habsburg financial institution, unless it came from a network accustomed to operating across Catholic boundaries? Finally, we turn to the most enduring symbol of Habsburg power, the imperial crown. Topped not with a traditional fleur-de-lis or a simple cross, but a distinct, squat, Byzantine-style arch, set above an octagonal cap, evoking both Eastern influence and the geometry favored in Templar architecture. And within that cap, hidden behind fabric, is a lining stitched with a repeating motif interlocking circles surrounding a star. Some say it's just a decorative flourish. Others believe it's a veiled invocation, something hidden in plain sight, worn by emperors who understood they were not the first to rule from the shadows. So no, there's no single document linking the Habsburgs to a surviving Templar command. But history isn't always about signed papers. Sometimes it's about shape, pattern, the same hand guiding different tools. And if the Templars needed an empire to survive within one that prized continuity, secrecy, and the manipulation of power through heritage, then the Habsburgs would have made the perfect host. He crowned himself, you know. Napoleon Bonaparte, in a move that shocked the papacy and electrified Europe, took the imperial crown from the Pope's trembling hands and placed it on his own head. It was a gesture soaked in symbolism of independence, of defiance of ancient rights reclaimed by force. But buried beneath the grand theatrics and revolutionary rhetoric was something stranger, a symbol, a motif that appeared again and again across his empire, the phoenix. Not the eagle. That was Rome. That was Caesar. The phoenix was older, deeper, a creature that does not just conquer, but returns reborn from fire, ashes, and destruction. And some believe it wasn't a metaphor Napoleon chose. It was one he inherited, quietly. Through a chain of signs, advisors, and relics linked not to Rome, but to something far more secretive. Let's rewind to his Egyptian campaign. In 1798, Napoleon embarked on what was ostensibly a military conquest, but quickly became an expedition of curiosity. He brought with him not just soldiers, but scholars, cartographers, linguists, antiquarians. While much attention is given to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, there was another less publicized find, a fragment of stone tablet, bearing a strange combination of Greek and Latin script, flanked by a cross with forked ends. The carving included the phrase, "In cineribus veritas, in ashes the truth." This artifact, though dismissed by many as a forgery or joke, reportedly traveled back with Napoleon tucked among dozens of crates marked for the Bibliothèque Nationale. Years later, in a letter to Josephine, he references the fire-born path, calling it older than Alexandria, wiser than the church, and still watching. Scholars attribute this to poetic nonsense. But the phrasing uncannily mirrors language found in 14th century Templar scrolls recovered near Troyes, where the order's French commandery once stood. More tangible is the matter of Napoleon's inner circle. Several of his most trusted officers, including Joachim Murat and Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, were known members of various esoteric societies. Notably, these included Masonic lodges bearing obscure names like Chevalier de l'Aurore, Knights of the Dawn, and l'Ordre de l'Étoile de l'Est, the Order of the Star of the East. These groups, while publicly affiliated with Freemasonry, practiced rituals involving resurrection through fire guardianship of ancient vows and references to the temple before the temple. These aren't standard Masonic phrases. They echo a different tradition. Even more intriguing are the symbols that began appearing throughout Napoleonic architecture and iconography. In the Hôtel des Invalides, where Napoleon would later be entombed, stained glass windows include stylized eight-pointed stars and circles within squares, designed suspiciously close to Templar floor plans used in early commanderies. The imperial coronation medallion minted in 1804 features not just the eagle, but hidden in the border engraving a rising bird wreathed in flame. Not a Roman eagle, a phoenix. And beneath it, the Latin inscription, Renascitur ex cinere, it rises again from the ash. What does all this suggest? Some believe Napoleon saw himself not just as emperor, but as a culmination. A phoenix king restoring a lineage that had been cut down centuries before. There are obscure French texts, rare pamphlets circulated among secret societies that refer to him as le 13e flambeau, the 13th torch. It's an odd title until you remember the original Templar leadership counted 12 high-ranking officers beneath the Grand Master. If the order had endured in secret, and a 13th torch had risen to reclaim its dream under a new banner, then perhaps Napoleon was not self-made, but carefully chosen. Another layer emerges when examining the Napoleonic Code. It wasn't just law. It was a framework, an attempt to replace divine right rule with rational structure. A separation of church and state with religious tolerance, secular education, and individual rights at its heart. Progressive, absolutely, but also very much in line with the whispers we've traced through this network, a system designed to erode papal power and install a new order based on knowledge geometry and silent oaths. Let's not forget the expedition to Malta. Napoleon seized the island from the Knights of St. John, the so-called successors of the Templar tradition. Yet he didn't raze their fortresses or desecrate their archives. He preserved them, shipped many artifacts back to France, installed his own administrators. Almost as if he already knew what lay behind those walls. The final strange coincidence, his tomb, circular, multi-layered, topped with a massive sarcophagus made of red quartzite, the same material used for pharaohs. His body lies beneath floor level, viewed from above in silence. No crosses, no crucifix, only stars, laurels, and a whisper of fire. A design more aligned with ancient cults than Catholic tradition. So was Napoleon a Templar successor, probably not in any formal sense. But was he a recipient of their legacy? A figure who inherited not the title but the script, quite possibly. He moved with a confidence that suggested old maps, old alliances, and an understanding that power wasn't just taken, it was transmitted. Through symbol, through silence, through fire. Among all the theories swirling through the dark waters of Vatican intrigue, few ripple more deeply than the one whispered behind gilded sacristy doors that the Jesuits were created not merely as missionaries or educators, but as a countermeasure, or depending on who you ask, a continuation. Two orders, two legacies. One mission reshaped by centuries of secret inheritance. And at the center of this theory stands a shadowy title, the Black Pope. Officially, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus is a man of spiritual discipline and organizational excellence. He oversees the Jesuits' global network of schools, seminaries, and social missions. He is called Black, not for sinister reasons, but for his simple black robes, humble in contrast to the crimson of cardinals and the white of the pontiff. But in the world of rumor and unofficial history, the Black Pope is far more than an administrator. He is the silent architect, the keeper of deeper plans. Now, why would anyone associate the Jesuits with the Templars, two orders born centuries apart, one disbanded by papal bull, the other founded under papal blessing? On the surface, they couldn't be more different. But look closer and unsettling parallels begin to surface. Both were born in times of existential crisis for the Church. The Templars in the wake of the First Crusade, the Jesuits during the fires of the Reformation. Both were elite forces, well-educated, tightly disciplined, and bound by vows that exceeded those of ordinary clergy. Both spread across Europe with astonishing speed, and both quickly became entangled in diplomacy, espionage, and influence at the highest levels. But it's the Jesuit founding story that draws the most speculation. Ignatius of Loyola, a wounded Basque knight turned visionary, received a revelation during his convalescence. He wrote the spiritual exercises designed not just for prayer, but for transformation, a method of reordering the self. His recruits were few but fanatically loyal. And among the earliest members, several were drawn not from monasteries, but from noble families with deep histories. Some traced back to regions that once sheltered fugitive Templars. Take Diego Lainez, Ignatius's immediate successor. He came from a family in Castile with old military ties and was educated not in Rome, but in Alcalá, a region known for obscure underground networks of alchemical and heretical speculation. or Francis Borgia, the third superior general, whose lineage included popes and monarchs, but also discrete links to the Aragonese courts, where post-Templar exiles found sanctuary. Even more compelling is the way the Jesuits organized themselves. No abbots, no fixed monasteries, no clinging to land. Instead, they moved like a network cells embedded in universities' courts and far-flung missions. Communication was swift. Obedience was absolute. Members were expected to carry out orders without question and dissolve into local customs without attracting notice. Replace cassocks with cloaks, and the methods align remarkably with what Templar agents were believed to do after 1312. There's also the matter of their relationship with the Vatican. Both orders quickly rose to immense power and then provoked suspicion. The Templars were suppressed for their wealth and secrecy. The Jesuits were expelled from multiple countries in the 18th century. For similar reasons, they were too influential, too untouchable, too connected. In fact, the Society of Jesus was officially suppressed by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, just as Enlightenment ideologies began dismantling the old monarchies, many of which the Jesuits had been advising behind the scenes. And where did the Jesuits go during their suppression? Some retreated into Eastern European courts. Some fled to Portugal and Brazil, but others, according to a few odd reports, sought refuge in Masonic lodges, sympathetic to their cause. There are even documents suggesting that deposed brothers of the temple offered sanctuary to Jesuit operatives under assumed identities. What kind of temple this refers to is left unclear. Then there's the iconography. While the Jesuit seal officially features the IHS monogram, several older Jesuit chapels include symbols that predate their founding: the eight-pointed star, the cross patée, the rose encircled by thorns. At the Church of the Gesù in Rome, a minor side chapel features stained glass windows depicting knights, not saints, with no names, just symbols and Latin phrases like veritas arderem vincit, truth conquers fire. The context is never explained, but perhaps the strangest clue of all lies in a curious manuscript, dated 1634, found in the private library of a defrocked bishop in Toledo. It's a theological treatise with heavy marginal notes, none signed, but bearing the same looping, archaic handwriting throughout. One annotation, next to a passage on papal succession, reads, "The flame that died in 1314 did not go out. It was buried. The society is not the flame. It is the oil." So, what does this mean? Did the Templars become the Jesuits? Almost certainly not in a linear sense. But did fragments of the Templar legacy, its knowledge, its networks, its methods, survive through absorption into the Jesuit structure, perhaps? The Jesuits are masters of education, but also of adaptation. They could have inherited a pattern, not a pedigree. And the idea of the Black Pope as a covert guardian of ancient secrets, while tantalizingly cinematic, is not wholly imaginary. He does command a vast global network. He does answer to no one but the Pope himself. And in the right light, he could very well be seen not as the heir of Loyola, but of someone older, someone who once rode beneath the banner of Solomon's temple. So perhaps the Jesuits are not the shadow of the Templars, but their echo. Not their resurrection, but their recursion. And the Black Pope, maybe he's not the one who wears the crown of fire. Maybe he just keeps the ashes warm. It always comes down to what's missing. Not the declarations carved in stone or the bulls announced from balconies, but the letters never sent. The notes tucked into drawers, the drafts burned before dawn. And perhaps nowhere is the silence louder than in Avignon, a city that for nearly 70 years became the reluctant heart of the papacy. While Rome simmered in chaos, 7 popes ruled from this southern French enclave. and within its fortress walls, among the red stone towers and vaulted libraries, something peculiar was preserved: a series of letters that were never meant to survive. The Avignon papacy, often framed as an embarrassing detour in church history, was in fact a moment of strategic recalibration. It began in 1309, just as the Templars were being dismembered by fire and accusation. Clement V, the very pope who had signed their death warrant, moved his court to Avignon, conveniently close to Philip IV of France. Many assume this was simple obedience to royal pressure, but others believe Clement had reasons of his own, reasons tied to what the Church had not managed to destroy. When the Templar trials began, thousands of documents were seized: scrolls, ledgers, relic inventories, letters. Some were clearly heretical, others mundane. But a small percentage, classified in the Vatican's internal registry as epistolae obscurae, were never catalogued in full. And according to inventory slips recovered in the mid-19th century, dozens of these letters were redirected to Avignon. Why? One explanation is that Clement, increasingly unsure of the trial's legitimacy, chose to personally safeguard the most sensitive records. Another suggests that he feared the implications: what the documents revealed, whom they implicated, or what they proved. A few researchers even argue that the letters weren't about the Templars at all, but about something they had uncovered. Among the few surviving fragments is one letter addressed from an unnamed master of the temple, dated just weeks before the mass arrests in 1307. It refers cryptically to the scroll of descent and the witness of blood hidden within the line of shadows. That language, steeped in allegory, has been interpreted in a dozen different ways. Some say it refers to royal bloodlines. Others think it points to buried relics or apocryphal texts. But whatever it was enough to panic a pope. And then there's the letter to Bertrand de Gaulle Clement V, before he ascended to the papacy. This letter, partially translated and cited in a footnote to a suppressed Jesuit dissertation, references the keys beneath St. Mary's bones and ends with the phrase, "Do not let the line break. It is not yet time." Who wrote it, no one knows. It is unsigned. But its inclusion in a list of documents removed from the Roman vault strongly suggests Templar origin. We also have reports, never officially confirmed, of a private correspondence between Clement and the head of a monastic order in Iberia. The contents are sealed, but the response, preserved in a separate archive, includes the phrase, "We still carry their light, though the lamp is broken." What light this refers to remains a mystery. Even more puzzling is the so-called iron chest. Rumored to have been housed beneath the papal palace in Avignon, it appears in multiple inventories across centuries, often marked only as non aperire, do not open. It was said to contain maps, heretical manuscripts, and an object of gold with 7 sides. When revolutionaries sacked the palace during the French Revolution, the chest vanished. Some say it was looted. Others claim it was moved by whom no one knows. Adding to the intrigue is the fact that in the 1370s, the last Avignon Pope, Gregory V, issued a strange directive: several papal letters were to be retranslated and recopied in the old tongue, then stored in the chamber of the silent keys. That chamber, identified in modern floor plans, has since been converted into a gallery. But in its original form, it had no windows, no direct access, and according to the architectural blueprints, its walls were triple-lined with lead and limestone, far more than required for simple record storage. Of course, it's possible all of this is just medieval bureaucracy, anomalies in inventory, overzealous scribes. Historians love to remind us that the Church was obsessive with paperwork. But then why do these specific letters keep surfacing at the edges of unrelated inquiries? Why do they appear in 18th century Rosicrucian diagrams, in Masonic lodge rituals, in alchemical codices bearing watermarks from Templar regions? One theory posits that the letters outline a pact, an uneasy agreement between certain popes and remnants of the Templar hierarchy. The pact didn't absolve the order, but preserved its knowledge. In exchange for secrecy, perhaps, or services rendered in the East. It's speculative, yes, but it would explain the odd gentleness with which certain ex-Templars were treated, and why some of their properties were held in trust rather than seized outright. It would also explain the persistent rumor that somewhere in the Avignon archives there exists a letter never opened, addressed not to a pope, but to the one who comes after. That phrase recurs in multiple contexts throughout European occult tradition. Some believe it's messianic. Others interpret it as a warning, a kind of relay message meant to activate if certain patterns repeat. And perhaps they have, because while the Church has shifted, modernized, and spun outward into the global age, the shadows it once cast remain. And if those letters were never destroyed, if they remain quietly coded deep within a labyrinth of parchment and stone, then maybe the truth the Templars carried wasn't erased, just delayed. By the late 1700s, a new kind of power was rising, not on the battlefield, not from the pulpit, but in the vault. International banking was no longer a tool of royal treasuries. It was becoming the engine behind them. And at the center of this revolution stood one name: Rothschild. 5 brothers, 5 capitals. One family quietly wiring the fate of Europe from behind silk-draped salons and candlelit balance sheets. But for some, the story doesn't start there. They whisper that the Rothschild rise wasn't a spark, it was a handoff. That behind the gilded ledgers, the system they used wasn't theirs. To understand this theory, you'd have to trace not just the money, but the method. The Rothschild model was elegant, discreet lending to sovereigns coupled with a spiderweb of couriers and coded letters. But that structure, in all its precision, bore uncanny resemblance to the old Templar treasury model. The Knights had once developed the earliest recognizable network of pan-European financial exchange: deposit here, withdraw there. Passwords, tokens, seals. Not just secure banking, but silent surveillance of political stability. And when the order fell, those tools didn't disappear, they scattered. Some went underground in Italy. Others, it seems, made their way north. Documents from Bruges and Lyon show accounts being quietly transferred under generic monastic names like Domus Clara Lux or Fratres Pontis. These weren't typical monastery ledgers. They recorded debts owed by nobility interest accrued from grain shipments and, most tellingly, investments in shipping companies tied to Iberian exploration. Those structures would resurface centuries later, now fully legalized under the smiling discretion of men in tailored coats and timepiece chains. Enter Meyer Amschel Rothschild, a coin dealer in Frankfurt who within 2 decades became a financial confidant to princes. Most biographies paint him as a savvy merchant, but one piece often gets overlooked. In his early career, Meyer worked with a man named Karl von Friedberg, a Swiss accountant with links to obscure banking guilds tracing back to Geneva's pre-Reformation religious orders. The Friedberg name surfaces interestingly in the property ledgers of Cistercian outposts, known for sheltering Templar remnants after the dissolution. Coincidence, possibly. But there's more. When Nathan Rothschild established the London branch, his signature move was speed. Information faster than anyone else. Battle outcomes before official dispatches. Wheat prices before markets adjusted. And how did he do it? Horse-riding couriers trained in coded communication. The exact same technique described in Templar codices used during the Crusades, relayed via abbeys' toll houses and certain knightly estates that happened to survive the suppression. Of course, information can be copied, But architecture is harder to fake. In several of the early Rothschild bank buildings, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, the cellars and hidden safes weren't designed by local masons. They followed peculiar geometric codes, including a layout that mirrored old Templar chapels, octagonal vaults, six-pointed ventilation grids, angled corridors designed to block sound travel. Some were repurposed wine vaults, sure, but others they look more like something built to outlast siege and scrutiny alike. Skeptics argue that these overlaps are simply signs of efficiency. After all, good ideas travel. But if so, why did the Rothschilds, a Jewish family, adopt subtle Christian symbology in their interior decor, fleur-de-lis, occult crosses, floor mosaics matching ancient alchemical diagrams, many of which had been copied from Templar manuscripts now lost or locked in private archives? One particularly odd motif, the phoenix, not rare, but its specific stylization, wings furled flame behind talons resting on a scroll, matches the seal of a known Templar offshoot once operating near Tarragona. That seal was found engraved in a chalice recovered from an old abbey near the Pyrenees in 1907. The chalice vanished into a private collection the following year. Let's pivot. The Rothschilds were also known for their careful neutrality, financing both sides in wars, maintaining balance between rivals. But that policy wasn't new. Templar financial doctrine emphasized equidistance in conflict, a necessity when navigating Christian and Muslim territories. The order lent to both crusaders and local lords in the Levant. Their ledgers reflect a pragmatic ethic: maintain the vessel, not the voyage. And some believe that ethos didn't die, it was inherited. In the early 1800s, rumors swirled around a secret compact between several European families, wealthy, discreet, interconnected. The group was called La Mano Silenciosa, or the Silent Hand. According to a series of letters between agents of Napoleon and certain Baltic nobles, this alliance wielded considerable sway over grain routes, armament loans, and even papal elections. One name repeatedly shows up: the Rothschilds. Another, a cipher that translates to Custodes Templi, the guardians of the temple. Naturally, this is all circumstantial, but it grows harder to ignore when modern intelligence analysts, while combing through old Soviet files, found references to a network labeled the Templar Protocol. Not a real organization, they say, but a nickname used by KGB codebreakers to describe financial shifts, too coordinated to be random. Their maps showed capital flow patterns through Zurich, Lisbon, and London, exactly the route of the old Templar exodus. And in the margin of one declassified report, someone had scribbled a note in Cyrillic: same knights, new armor. So perhaps the real legacy of the Templars wasn't spiritual at all. Perhaps it was structural. An invisible system of power, a framework that outlasted crowns, regimes, and revolutions. And if that framework was handed off quietly from cloaked knights to velvet bankers, then maybe the names changed. But the code endured. Because in the end, real power isn't loud. It doesn't shout from balconies or wave banners in the street. It whispers in safe rooms, signs anonymous ledgers, and builds cathedrals of influence beneath the noise. And it almost never dies. They called it the war to end all wars. But behind the trenches of World War I, beyond the ashes of Versailles, and deep beneath the cold calculations of World War II, something else stirred, a pattern. Not just of politics, but of precision. Certain alliances formed too cleanly. Certain fortunes ballooned too quickly. And in quiet rooms where generals weren't invited, decisions flickered like candle flames in a draft. The question isn't who fought the wars, but who framed them. The early 20th century was a symphony of upheaval. Empires fell, borders redrew themselves, and modern intelligence networks were born. But in the midst of these tectonic shifts, familiar fingerprints appear. In 1916, British intelligence suddenly secured rare, accurate maps of Austro-Hungarian artillery zones, maps traced with compass lines and marginalia in Latin. According to internal memos, the documents were acquired through ecclesiastical intermediaries in Lisbon. That alone would be curious. But the maps bore an insignia not used by any modern agency, a double cross flanked by a sword and chalice, identical to a Templar variant uncovered near Tomar centuries earlier. Of course, symbols can be borrowed. But the pattern continues. In both world wars, key resistance networks in occupied Europe operated with mysterious funding and support lines. In France, the Nocturnes used medieval monasteries for message drops. In Poland, couriers from the Silent Brotherhood wore rings engraved with Jerusalem crosses passed down from grandfathers who served no flag. And in Switzerland, an independent banking cell, never formally tied to any government, held funds allegedly earmarked for post-conflict rebalancing. Its trustees, descendants of obscure knightly families with no public fortune but vast private estates. It gets more tangled. American OSS operatives in WW2, precursors to the CIA, frequently reported interference from unnamed civilian advisors during European missions. These advisors operated in shadows never directly identified, but described as deeply Catholic, multilingual, and unnervingly prescient. One field agent called them ghost sponsors. Another claimed his orders were redirected via a sealed envelope signed with an ancient cipher identical to a symbol found in Templar rites, the Sigillum Crucis Inclinatum. There's also the case of Operation Gladio, NATO's secret stay-behind network during the Cold War. While technically post-W Gladio cells were composed of men trained well before the war ended, some with Masonic ties and clerical endorsements. One Italian cell leader arrested in the 1970s carried a codex bound in deerskin, containing Latin phrases describing the eternal temple in exile. Under interrogation, he claimed to be part of La Rete Vecchia, the old net. Authorities assumed it meant a fascist remnant. Others wondered if it meant something older still. Then there's the intelligence pattern, from Bletchley Park to the Enigma program. Breakthroughs often came from unexpected minds, linguists trained in monastic logic, mathematicians whose family histories traced back to vanished aristocracies, and consultants who vanished from records after 1945. In one peculiar MI6 memo, a staffer comments, "The silent ones move fast when the balance tips. They do not serve the king, they serve the thread." Capital T. But perhaps the clearest echo comes from Spain. During the Civil War, both nationalist and Republican factions attempted to secure a treasure believed to be hidden beneath the monastery of Montserrat. Rumors swirled of ancient artifacts, secret scrolls, or a vault designed by Cistercians with Templar patronage. Franco's men secured the site, but according to unsealed Vatican correspondence, the treasure had already been moved. By whom? A group known only as La Mano Nera, the Black Hand. Their trail vanishes across the Pyrenees, reappearing in Lisbon 6 months later. Records of their existence stop cold after the war ends. Skeptics, of course, raise eyebrows, and rightly so. Wars are messy, coincidences abound. But when similar symbols appear across decades in the hands of men who claim no allegiance but always know where the wires run, it's hard not to feel the thread beneath the surface, a shadow running parallel to modern history. Quiet, coordinated, and very, very old. Because what if war isn't always chaos? What if sometimes it's choreography, a way to clear the board? Reshuffle power, or extinguish knowledge that no longer fits the narrative. And what if every time the board resets, the same hands arrange the pieces not to win, but to ensure no one else does? By the end of World War II, the world looked different. Flags changed, nations crumbled, but certain fortunes remained untouched, certain networks untouched, and in the ruins a silence, the kind that lingers long after the last gunshot, as if someone was waiting, watching, and ready to rebuild again. You live in an age that prides itself on exposure. Every digital shadow is tracked. Every secret, it seems, leaks. And yet, there are places, both physical and institutional, that remain remarkably silent. Not because they're irrelevant, but because they've perfected the art of subtlety. If the old Templar network really did survive morphing across centuries through royal courts and revolutions, then it stands to reason that it didn't simply dissolve with the 20th century. It adapted. The first trail doesn't begin in a castle or an old abbey. It begins with a cyber attack. In 2014, a banking breach in Luxembourg exposed a set of encrypted messages never meant to be read. While financial in tone, the language raised eyebrows, references to the eternal balance, chambers of Concord, and a disturbing phrase, the last cloister prepares. None of it traced to any existing intelligence agency. The IP trails dead-ended in Romania. The funds routed through a shell firm whose board included a descendant of the de Molay line. Then there's the re-emergence of order-based nomenclature within elite academic circles. The Rhodes Trust, once focused on British imperial scholarship, quietly partnered with a new foundation calling itself Custodes Lucis, Guardians of the Light. Though allegedly secular, its founders wore insignia almost identical to those uncovered in Tamar. In a leaked internal lecture, one scholar spoke openly of building continuity between collapsed institutions through ancestral frameworks, a fancy way of saying inheritance before merit. In Italy, a new financial guild, the Silver Pillar Consortium, formed in 2009 with the mission of preserving intergenerational wisdom within elite banking cultures. Their headquarters, an unassuming restored monastery outside Siena. Inside, murals of knights, faded Latin inscriptions, and a replica of a Templar seal mounted in polished obsidian. Their operations span real estate, art, insurance, and rare book preservation. But their deeper purpose unknown. The only public-facing trustee is a Jesuit-trained economist fluent in Aramaic. A curiosity, if nothing else. More alarmingly, political analysts have flagged the subtle reappearance of medieval symbology in elite gatherings. The 2018 Bilderberg Summit in Turin allegedly hosted a closed-door session titled Guardianship and Global Identity. One attendee, an Eastern European finance minister, was seen wearing a lapel pin shaped like a stylized Jerusalem cross, a design not sold or known to mainstream Masonic circles. The minister resigned months later without explanation. His family has since moved to Malta. In digital spaces, the Templar thread coils deeper. A closed forum on the dark web, known only as Red Temple, allegedly operated between 2016 and 2020, sharing translated Latin documents, genealogical data of European royal lines, and encryption keys matching medieval cipher wheels. A leaked archive from the forum includes a modernized rule of secrecy referencing the preservation of the temple beyond flesh. Among the usernames, Bruce 20 Scion Ghost, and one tagged simply La Rosa, the Rose. Then the forum vanished. Let's not forget Silicon Valley. Anomalies have emerged there too. A startup accelerator in Palo Alto began in 2021 with deep backing from unknown benefactors. Their name, Equinox Covenant. Publicly, they focus on blockchain security and sovereign identity. Privately, whistleblowers suggest they're obsessed with non-linear inheritance models and sacral architecture theory. Their company logo, a stylized compass flanked by two parallel vertical lines eerily close to early Templar stone marks. And in the personal sphere, descendants of noble lines have become oddly visible again. A surge of books, documentaries, and think pieces glamorizing bloodline resilience and hidden inheritance isn't just nostalgia, it feels coordinated. More than one self-styled historian has received invitations to private history circles hosted at restored European abbeys. These events require no phones. They share no agendas. They always end at dusk. Is all of this proof? No. But it's an unsettling cluster of shadows. Separate, they're just anomalies. Together, they begin to echo. The pattern is subtle, that's the point. The greatest trick a secret order ever pulled wasn't hiding behind thrones. It was convincing you that thrones were still where the power lived. If they still exist, they are no longer men in armor. They are networks of inheritance, of silence, of leverage. They've traded swords for symbols, parchment for code relics, for algorithms. And while the world screams louder with every passing year, they grow quieter, more precise, more deliberate. The last cloister may not be made of stone. It may be a protocol, a trust fund, a bloodline, and it's still functioning. You've followed the whispers through smoke-filled cathedrals, beneath city stones, behind palace walls. Names faded, symbols hidden. Fortunes passed silently from one generation to the next. But now, with all the dust disturbed and the lines connected, a single unsettling question begins to flicker at the edges of your thoughts. What if they never disappeared? What if the suppression of the Templars wasn't an end, but a rebrand? Because what you've seen isn't survival, it's strategy. From the very beginning, the Templars operated with a dual face. On the surface, warrior monks. Beneath a logistical empire. Pilgrim routes, banking systems, encrypted correspondence, these weren't medieval flourishes. They were systems of control, infrastructure. And when that structure was threatened by the church and crown, they didn't fight back openly. They receded, like breath behind frosted glass, like muscle pulled back before a strike. Consider the way they vanished. A mass arrest order, yes, but only in France. England hesitated. Portugal rebadged them. Scotland sheltered them. Their records in Cyprus and Jerusalem were incomplete, sometimes erased, sometimes replaced. Their ships didn't burn. They sailed, and where they landed, little outposts bloomed. Guilds, fraternities, religious houses, all loosely connected, like the mycelium beneath a forest, unseen but everywhere. And those symbols, they didn't vanish either. They simply shed their skin. A Templar cross becomes a geometric company logo. The double-crossed keys of a papal bull evolve into the insignia of a private bank. Heraldry bleeds into branding. And somewhere along the line, even historians stopped questioning why the same shapes kept reappearing across centuries. You've also seen the alliances, monarchies that mysteriously prospered, banking houses that rose from ruin, art movements that wove ancient codes into canvas. Always, always the same story, silence followed by influence. No declarations, no creeds. Just leverage applied with surgical patience. Then there's the language. Certain phrases reappear in diplomatic correspondence. Custodians of balance, guardians of order. They crop up in letters from cardinals, kings, bankers, and generals, none of whom ever seem to know where the phrases originate. Only that they've been passed down, expected, understood. It makes sense, doesn't it? If your order had been branded heretical, your brothers hunted, your archives scattered, you'd stop building monuments. You'd start building mechanisms, networks without names, organizations with shifting acronyms. You'd bury your symbols in law, in finance, in diplomacy. You wouldn't protect relics, you'd protect ideas. And you'd ensure those ideas outlasted every crown constitution and collapse. The truth is, there may be no modern Templar order, not officially, but something continued. It learned, it diversified, it kept the principles and discarded the robes. Its goal, possibly unchanged, the stewardship of knowledge, the containment of chaos, the shaping of succession. Look at how modern elites behave. Quiet retreats in fortified estates, rituals disguised as networking, global influence managed not through governance, but through capital philanthropy and narrative. It's Templarism without swords, authority without visibility, a crown made not of gold, but of data, debt, and diplomacy. And you've felt it, haven't you? That sense that power has a hidden current, that beneath the visible institutions, something else arranges the game. Not always malicious, but always deliberate. Not a government, not a religion, not a cult, a structure, a shadow that never left. It doesn't need to rule directly, just to whisper in the right ears, fund the right campaigns, preserve the right secrets, and every few centuries raise a phoenix from the ash. Because if there's one lesson the Templars learned best, it's this: permanence doesn't require visibility, just continuity. And when you trace the network back through the monasteries, the vaults, the battles, the treaties, you don't find a broken line. You find a braid, tight, intact, still pulling. So here you are, at the end or perhaps the edge of something that was never really meant to be seen whole. You've walked through centuries of smoke and silence, listened to vanished voices murmur through stone and scroll, followed symbols across empires like stars in a constellation no modern map will name. And still, the question lingers, not in thunder, but in a hush, if they still exist. What are they doing now? Maybe the answer isn't in what they hold, but what they protect. Perhaps the true currency of a shadow order is not gold or land or even power, but time, longevity, memory. The ability to stretch across generations without dissolving into myth. To observe, not command. To influence, not control. To wait even when the world forgets you. And what of us? In an age that worships transparency, thrives on noise, and loses history faster than we can digitize it. What happens when those who remember still operate from the shadows? What happens when the last true stewards of continuity no longer answer to nations, but to something older, something nameless? It's not about cloaks or catacombs. It's not even about conspiracy. It's about rhythm, pattern, the quiet geometry behind power. You might never find the names. That's by design. But every time a crown is passed without blood, a crisis resolved behind glass, a legacy protected from the flame's pause. Listen. Somewhere perhaps in a library no GPS can find. A candle flickers, and the old vows remain unbroken. Before we vanish, too, take a breath and remember they never needed a throne. They built the room it stands in.